Indianapolis was already 2 hours behind me when I decided to skip the interstate and take the back roads home that October evening. I'd just finished a job interview at a pharmaceutical company, my third that month since getting laid off. And honestly, the thought of sitting in rush hour traffic while replaying another rejection in my head seemed unbearable. Being 29 and starting over from scratch wasn't part of the plan, but neither was the factory closure that left half my town unemployed, so here I was, choosing random county roads through rural Indiana just to feel like I had some control over something. The cornfields rose up on both sides like canyon walls, dry and rustling in that late harvest way that makes everything sound like whispers. I'd lived in Fort Wayne my whole life, but these particular backroads were new to me, each turn revealing another stretch of identical stalks that seemed to go on forever, broken only by the occasional weathered barn or grain silo standing against the dimming sky. My phone battery was at 12% when I noticed the GPS had stopped updating 20 minutes ago. The little blue dot frozen somewhere near a town called Millbrook that I'd never heard of. The screen showed 6:52 p.m., and the October sun was already sinking behind the corn, throwing long shadows across the dirt road I'd somehow ended up on. I kept telling myself the next intersection would bring me back to pavement, back to civilization. But each turn just led deeper into the maze of agricultural roads that probably only made sense to the farmers who'd been driving them for generations. The Nissan Altima wasn't exactly built for this terrain. Every pothole sent a worrying creak through the suspension, and dust was billowing up behind me in thick clouds that caught the dying light. When the road narrowed to barely more than a tractor path, corn stalks scraping against both sides of my car, with a sound like fingernails on metal, I finally admitted to myself that I was completely, utterly lost. The engine started making the noise around 7:15, just as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the horizon. It began as a subtle clicking, like a playing card and bicycle spokes, but within minutes it had evolved into this grinding metal-on-metal sound that made my chest tight with panic. The temperature gauge was creeping toward the red zone, and wisps of steam were starting to curl up from under the hood, visible in the beams of my headlights that now provided the only illumination on this forgotten stretch of dirt. I pumped the brakes, feeling the car shudder and resist until I finally came to a stop in what seemed like the middle of absolute nowhere. The silence that followed when I turned off the ignition was complete. No distant highway noise, no dogs barking, not even the sound of farming equipment. Just the ticking of hot metal cooling and the endless rustling of corn that surrounded me on all sides, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows even with my high beams on. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at my phone as it searched desperately for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The battery dropped to 11% while I watched, and I realized I needed to save what little power remained in case I found a spot with coverage. My hands were trembling, not from cold but from that special kind of fear that comes when you realize exactly how alone and unprepared you are. The nearest town I could remember passing was at least 40 minutes back, and that was when the car was actually running. I popped the hood release and stepped out into the October night, immediately hit by how much colder it had gotten once the sun went down. The air smelled like dried corn husks and diesel fuel, and underneath that, something else. Maybe fertilizer. Maybe just the scent of soil that had been baking all day and was now releasing its heat into the darkness. The hood was too hot to touch at first, and when I finally got it propped open, a cloud of steam billowed out, making me stumble backward into the dirt road. I knew absolutely nothing about cars beyond checking oil and adding windshield fluid, another life skill I'd always relied on others to handle. The engine block was making these pinging sounds as it cooled, and I could see fluid dripping steadily onto the ground, creating a dark puddle that looked black in the beam of my phone's flashlight. That's when I noticed it, a pinpoint of light moving through the corn, maybe 200 yards away, swaying slightly like someone walking with a flashlight. Relief flooded through me so fast I actually laughed out loud. Thank God, I thought. A farmer checking his fields or maybe someone else whose car had broken down earlier. I raised my arm and was about to shout when something made me hesitate. The light wasn't moving along the rows like you'd expect from someone walking between planted corn. It was cutting straight through, stalks snapping and rustling, heading directly toward me. I stood there next to my dead car, watching that light get closer, and every instinct I had started screaming that something was wrong. Who walks through corn like that at night? The stalks are planted in rows specifically so you can walk between them during harvest. But this person, if it was a person, was bulldozing straight through like the corn wasn't even there. The sound reached me then, that distinctive crack and swoosh of breaking stalks, getting louder with each passing second. I turned in a slow circle, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing in the middle of this dirt road, with my car's headlights creating a bubble of visibility that probably made me look like a lighthouse in an ocean of darkness. There were no farmhouses visible in any direction, no distant porch lights or barn security lamps, just walls of corn that could have been hiding anything. The light stopped moving for a moment, maybe 100 yards away now, and I could swear whoever was holding it was watching me, evaluating, deciding something. My mouth went dry as I tried to call out a greeting, but the words died in my throat when the light started moving again. Faster this time, with purpose. The sound of breaking corn stalks grew louder, more violent, like someone was running through them now instead of walking. I scrambled back into my car, slamming the door and hitting the lock button so hard my finger hurt. The rational part of my brain kept saying this was probably just a farmer, maybe angry about someone being on his property. But farmers don't move like that through their own fields. They don't destroy their own crops. Through my windshield, I could see the light getting closer, maybe 50 yards now, and I could make out the shadowy outline of corn stalks falling away from whatever was pushing through them. My phone showed 9% battery when I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect. Just that horrible beeping sound that means no signal, not even for emergency calls. Then the light went out. Just like that, complete darkness where it had been, and the sound of breaking corn stopped too. The silence was worse than the noise had been because now I had no idea where they were, or what they were doing. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, breathing so hard the windows were starting to fog up, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my pulse in my ears. A minute passed, then two, and I was just starting to think maybe they'd given up and left when something slammed into the passenger side of my car, hard enough to rock it on its suspension. I couldn't help the scream that ripped out of me as I jerked away from the door, my elbow hitting the horn which blared out into the darkness. Through the fogged passenger window, I could barely make out a shape, human-sized but wrong somehow, just standing there, perfectly still. Then came the sound that still wakes me up at night. Fingernails slowly dragging across the glass, deliberate and patient, like someone testing how strong it was. The scratching moved around the car methodically. Passenger window, rear passenger, back windshield, then stopping at the driver's side, right next to where I was hunched against the center console trying to make myself as small as possible. This close, even through the fogged glass I could see more details that made my whole body go rigid with terror. The person was wearing what looked like a medical gown, the thin kind they give you at hospitals, completely inappropriate for the cold October night. Their hair was long and matted, hanging in clumps that might have been blonde once but now looked gray with dirt or worse. But it was the eyes that made me bite down on my knuckle to keep from screaming again, wide open, unblinking, staring at me through the window with an intensity that felt like being studied by something that had forgotten how to be human. They raised one hand and placed it flat against the glass, and I could see dirt caked under those long fingernails, what might have been dried blood on their wrist. They tilted their heads slowly, like a dog hearing a strange sound, never breaking eye contact. I fumbled for my phone with numb fingers, desperate enough to try 911 again even though I knew it wouldn't work. 7% battery now. The figure outside started making sounds, not words exactly, more like attempts at words, these wet gurgling noises that might have been speech if their throat wasn't damaged somehow. They kept tapping on the window with one finger, gentle and rhythmic, like they were trying to communicate in code. That's when I noticed the medical bracelet on their wrist, the plastic kind with printed information. Though I couldn't read it through the fog and darkness, A horrible thought crept into my mind. What if this person had escaped from somewhere, maybe a psychiatric facility or hospital? Indiana has several state facilities and someone in a medical gown wandering rural roads at night. But that didn't explain how they'd moved through the corn, or why they seemed to be enjoying this, because I swear I could see the corners of their mouth pulling up in something that wasn't quite a smile but wanted to be. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the figure stepped back from my car, disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights' reach. For a moment, I dared to hope they were leaving, but then I heard the trunk pop open. I'd locked the doors but forgotten the trunk release was broken. It had been that way for months, just another repair I couldn't afford. The car shifted as weight settled into the trunk area, and I could hear them rummaging through my emergency kit, metal clanking against metal. The tire iron, they'd found the tire iron. Panic shot through me like electricity as I turned the ignition key, pumping the gas pedal and pleading with the dead engine to somehow miraculously start. Nothing but clicks and the wheeze of a motor that had given up. The trunk slammed shut, and footsteps circled back to my door, slow and measured. Then came the first hit, the tire iron smashing into my side mirror, sending plastic and glass spraying across the dirt. They weren't trying to break in yet, just showing me they could, demonstrating what was about to happen. I did the only thing I could think of, laid on the horn and didn't let up. The blaring sound split the night, echoing off the corn and hopefully, reaching someone, anyone who might call the police. The figure outside actually stumbled backward, hands going to their ears, that grotesque almost smile turning into a grimace of pain or anger. They swung the tire iron at my windshield but missed, hitting the hood instead with a metallic clang that left a dent I could see even in the darkness. My phone battery hit 5% as I kept my palm pressed on the horn, watching this person in a hospital gown rage against my car, swinging the tire iron wildly now, no longer methodical but furious. They tried to scream something over the noise, but it came out as more of that liquid gargling, and I realized with sick certainty that something was definitely wrong with their throat. Maybe self-inflicted, maybe the reason they'd been institutionalized in the first place. The horn kept blaring and I kept pressing, even as my ears rang and my head pounded, because stopping meant silence, and silence meant they'd start working on getting inside again. Then I saw them, headlights cutting through the darkness from the direction I'd come, bouncing over the rutted dirt road. The figure in the hospital gown saw them too, their heads snapping toward the approaching lights with animal-like alertness. They dropped the tire iron and, without any hesitation, turned and crashed back into the corn, vanishing into the stalks as suddenly as they'd appeared. The gurgling sounds faded quickly, swallowed by the rustling maze of dried corn that seemed to close behind them like water. I kept the horn going until the vehicle, a massive John Deere green pickup, pulled up beside me, an older man with a gray beard rolling down his window with a concerned, confused expression. I finally let go of the horn, my palm throbbing, ears ringing in the sudden quiet. The farmer, because that's what he was, asked if I was okay, said he'd been checking his irrigation equipment 2 fields over when he heard the horn going crazy. I tried to explain about the person in the hospital gown, pointing at the smashed mirror, the dents in my car, but my words came out jumbled and hysterical. He believed me though, told me there'd been an escape from Logansport State Hospital earlier that day, some patient with a history of violence who'd injured 2 orderlies getting out. The police had been searching the main roads, but nobody thought to check these back farm routes. He called it in on his CB radio while I sat there shaking, then waited with me for 40 minutes until the state police arrived with their dogs and searchlights. They found the tire iron right where it had been dropped, found footprints and torn fabric on a corn stalk, but the person was gone, swallowed up by miles and miles of agricultural land. The police took my statement, arranged for a tow truck, gave me a ride to a motel in the nearest town. They caught the patient 3 days later, hiding in an abandoned grain silo near Lafayette, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration. I never learned their name or what they'd done to end up in that hospital, and honestly, I didn't want to know. What I do know is that I haven't driven anywhere without a charger cable since, and I take the interstate now, always the interstate, no matter how bad the traffic is. The farmhouse came cheap because nobody wanted to drive 40 minutes just to get groceries. That suited me fine after the divorce papers went through in August. 37 and starting fresh seemed easier when the nearest neighbor lived 2 miles down the gravel road. The property stretched maybe 5 acres total, most of it taken up by corn that the previous tenant had planted but never harvested. By the time I moved in that September, those stalks stood almost 7 feet tall, creating a dense green wall that ran right up to my backyard. The realtor, Nancy something or other, kept apologizing about the unkempt field, promising the owner would have it cleared before winter. I told her not to worry about it. The rustling sound at night actually helped me sleep, like white noise from nature instead of those machines people buy in the city. The first signs appeared maybe 3 weeks after I settled in. I'd gone out one morning to drink coffee on the back porch, watching the sun climb over those endless rows of corn, when I spotted a crumpled McDonald's wrapper near where the grass met the field, then a Marlboro butt, still fresh enough that the filter hadn't yellowed from rain. My first thought was teenagers, probably local kids who'd found a spot to smoke where their parents wouldn't catch them. God knows I'd done the same thing at their age, sneaking behind the gymnasium with stolen cigarettes. The muddy footprint on my deck bothered me more, but October had been wet, and delivery drivers never watched where they stepped. I grabbed a trash bag, picked up the litter, and made a mental note to mention it to Nancy next time she called to check how I was settling in. Kids would be kids, and eventually they'd get bored and find somewhere else to hang out. A week passed before I found the makeshift bed. I'd been walking along the field's edge, looking for my cat Brutus, who liked to hunt mice in the tall grass, when I noticed how the corn stalks bent inward about 20 feet from my bedroom window. Not broken, just carefully pushed aside to create a narrow tunnel. Curiosity got the better of me, and I ducked into the opening, pushing through the dense leaves that scratched at my arms. The smell hit me first, stale sweat mixed with something chemical, like old cologne trying to mask body odor. Someone had flattened maybe 6 feet of corn stalks into a rough oval, creating a hidden pocket completely invisible from the outside. Empty beer cans lined one edge. A ratty sleeping bag lay crumpled in the corner, still damp from the morning dew. But what made my throat close up was the collection of cigarette butts arranged in a neat little pyramid, all Marlboros, all facing the same direction, toward my house. The logical part of my brain kept insisting this was still teenagers, maybe some kid who'd gotten kicked out and needed a place to crash. But teenagers didn't organize their trash like that. Teenagers didn't position themselves with a perfect sightline to my bedroom window, where the corn had been bent just enough to create a gap no bigger than a fist. I backed out of that space, my shirt catching on the rough stalks, and walked straight into my house to call the sheriff's department. The deputy who showed up, a young guy named Brandon who couldn't have been older than 25, walked through the space with me, took some photos, and promised they'd increase patrols. He suggested motion lights for the backyard and maybe some cameras if I could afford them. The way he kept checking his phone and glancing at his watch told me everything. Weird trash in a cornfield didn't exactly qualify as an emergency in his book. I installed the motion lights that same afternoon, driving to the hardware store in town and spending money I didn't really have on 4 industrial-strength floodlights. The clerk, an older man with grease under his fingernails, helped me pick out the brightest ones they had, the kind that would blind you if you looked directly at them. While I was there, I grabbed a deadbolt for the back door and one of those wooden dowels to jam in the sliding glass door track. The installation took me until dark, up and down the ladder with a drill that kept slipping in my sweaty palms. Every rustle from the corn made me whip around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the field stayed empty. Just endless rows swaying in the evening breeze. That night the lights triggered constantly. A raccoon at midnight, wind-blown leaves at 2, a possum around 4. Each time that harsh white light flooded my yard, I'd jolt awake and peer through the blinds, scanning the illuminated grass for footprints, for movement, for anything that would prove I wasn't going crazy. The silence lasted 5 days. 5 days of motion lights catching nothing but animals. 5 days of checking that spot in the corn to find it undisturbed. 5 days of almost convincing myself that whoever it was had been scared off by the deputy's visit. Then, on Saturday night, all 4 lights went out at once. Not triggered, just dead like someone had cut the power. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the screen stayed black no matter how many times I pressed the button. The landline in the kitchen gave me nothing but silence. Even my laptop, which had been charging on the counter, wouldn't turn on. I stood in my dark kitchen, listening to my own breathing mix with the eternal rustling of corn. And that's when I heard it. The distinct sound of a sliding door being tested. That soft bump when someone lifts it to see if it's locked. The dowel held, but whoever was out there kept trying, patient and methodical, lifting and releasing, like they had all the time in the world. The testing stopped after maybe 10 minutes, but I knew he hadn't left. Through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow passing between my car and the shed, too tall and upright to be an animal. My keys hung on the hook by the front door, 15 feet away, but reaching them meant crossing in front of the living room windows. The old farmhouse had too many windows, I realized. Windows I'd loved when I moved in because they let in so much natural light. Now each dark pane felt like an eye, like someone could be pressed against any of them, watching me stand frozen in my kitchen. I grabbed a knife from the block, the big one I used for chopping vegetables, and tried to think. The nearest neighbor, the Gibsons, lived 2 miles away. Even if I ran, even if I made it to the road, it would take 20 minutes to reach their house. 20 minutes in the dark with someone following through the corn, knowing every shortcut while I stumbled blind down the gravel road. A soft knock on the back door made me bite down on my own tongue to keep from screaming. Not pounding or aggressive, just 3 gentle taps, like a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar. Then his voice came through the wood, conversational and calm, with this odd sing-song quality that made my spine go rigid. "I know you're awake in there. I've been watching you for weeks now, learning your routines. You make chamomile tea before bed, read those mystery novels in your bedroom until your eyes get heavy. You sleep on your left side, facing the window. Did you know you talk in your sleep sometimes? Mostly about work stress. But last night you said a man's name, Christopher. Is that the ex-husband? He knew things no one could know unless they'd been inside my house, unless they'd stood next to my bed while I slept. The knife felt useless in my hand, a joke against someone who'd been close enough to hear me breathing in the dark, and I'd never even known. "The police won't come," he continued, his mouth so close to the door I could hear his lips brush the wood. "Your phone's dead, remember? And even if you got to your car, well, I took care of that earlier. Cut the fuel line while you were in the shower this evening. You use lavender shampoo, by the way. The smell carries through the bathroom vent." My legs started shaking so hard I had to lean against the counter to stay upright. This morning's shower, I'd felt safe, normal, washing my hair and planning my weekend. He'd been right outside, close enough to smell my shampoo, sabotaging my car while I stood naked and vulnerable behind a thin curtain. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, and I heard something metal scraping against the door frame. "You're going to let me in, and we're going to talk about why you've been so rude, ignoring me when I've put so much effort into getting to know you. Or I'm going to come in anyway and we'll have a very different conversation." The scraping sound meant he was working on the lock, and the old farmhouse doors weren't exactly high security. I had maybe 2 minutes before he got through. The front door was an option, but running into the dark meant running blind while he knew the property better than I did after weeks of surveillance. Hiding seemed pointless when he'd already proven he could get inside whenever he wanted. Then I remembered the crawl space access in the bedroom closet. The realtor had mentioned it during the tour, apologizing for the lack of a proper basement. It led under the house, coming out through a wooden panel near the front porch that looked decorative from the outside. If I could get into the crawl space before he broke through the back door, maybe I could slip out the front while he searched the house. I moved as quietly as I could toward the bedroom, avoiding the creaky board near the hallway that I'd learned about my first week here. Behind me, the scraping continued, mixed with his humming. Some tune I didn't recognize, cheerful and wrong in the darkness. The crawl space was exactly as horrible as I'd imagined. Maybe 3 feet high, dirt floor, thick with spider webs and the smell of rotting wood. I pulled the panel closed behind me and started crawling, trying not to think about what else might be down here with me. My knees sank into the soft earth, and something with too many legs skittered across my hand. Above me, I heard the back door finally give way, then heavy footsteps moving through my kitchen. "Where did you go?" His voice was louder now, annoyed rather than conversational. "This doesn't have to be difficult. I've been patient, haven't I? Weeks of watching, waiting for the right time to introduce myself properly." The footsteps moved toward the living room and I crawled faster, my fingers searching for the panel that should be somewhere ahead. The space narrowed as I went, forcing me to army crawl on my belly through dirt that tasted like decay when I accidentally breathed through my mouth. His footsteps stopped directly overhead, and I heard him opening closet doors, checking rooms, methodical in his search. My fingers finally found the wooden panel, and I pushed against it slowly, terrified it would creak. Cool night air hit my face as it opened, and I could see my front yard bathed in moonlight, the road just 50 yards away. I squeezed through the opening, dirt in my hair and eyes, and started running before I was even fully standing. Behind me, I heard him yell. Not words, just raw frustration when he realized I wasn't in the house. The gravel road tore at my bare feet, but I kept running, powered by adrenaline and terror. Halfway to the Gibsons' house, headlights appeared ahead, their teenage son Nathan coming home late from work. I practically threw myself in front of his truck, screaming for help, probably looking absolutely insane, covered in dirt and spiderwebs. But Nathan didn't hesitate. He pulled me into the truck, locked the doors, and drove straight to his parents' house while calling 911 on his cell. When the real deputies arrived an hour later, not Brandon but older officers who took everything seriously, they found my back door broken, muddy footprints through my house, and that sleeping spot in the corn. But the man himself was gone, vanished into the miles of farmland and forest that surrounded the county. They never caught him. The investigation turned up DNA from the sleeping bag, fingerprints on my door frame, but nothing in any database. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Diane Russell, who'd worked stalking cases for 15 years, told me that wasn't unusual. "Some of these guys, they're ghosts until they escalate," she said, sitting across from me at the police station, while I gave my 5th statement. "You were smart to run. Smart to trust your instincts about those first signs." They found more evidence in the corn over the following days. Notebooks wrapped in plastic with detailed observations about my daily routines. Photographs taken through my windows with a telephoto lens. Even recordings of my phone conversations somehow captured from outside the house. The quantity suggested he'd been watching for months before I moved in. That maybe he'd been watching the property itself, waiting for someone like me, alone, isolated, vulnerable, to rent it. The owner had the corn cleared within a week, revealing 3 other makeshift camps at different vantage points around the property, each one positioned to watch a different side of the house. I stayed with the Gibsons for 2 weeks, while I arranged to break the lease and find somewhere new to live. A studio apartment in Columbus with a doorman and security cameras, neighbors close enough to hear if I screamed. The landlord tried to keep my security deposit, claiming I'd violated the lease terms, until Diane made a few phone calls and suddenly he was very accommodating, even refunding my last month's rent. Sometimes I Google the address of that farmhouse, checking if anyone new has rented it. So far, it stays empty. The listing photos showing my former bedroom with its big windows, the cleared field behind it looking naked and exposed without the corn. I still wake up some nights, convinced I can hear that patient lifting and releasing of a door, that cheerful humming in the darkness. My therapist says it's normal, that hypervigilance takes time to fade. But I notice things now, how many windows a place has, whether the doors are solid wood or hollow, if there are too many blind spots around a property. And I'll never again ignore those first small signs, those little violations that your mind wants to explain away. Because somewhere out there, he's probably doing it again, picking some other isolated farmhouse, some other woman living alone, starting with cigarette butts and footprints while he learns her routines. Patient and methodical, waiting for the perfect night to finally introduce himself. The cornfield behind the Brennan property stretches for what feels like miles, and during late August of 2022, the stalks stood nearly 8 feet tall, creating these dense walls of green that whispered whenever the wind picked up. I'd driven out there with my girlfriend Jess and our friend group for what was supposed to be just another bonfire before everyone scattered for college again. The Brennans owned about 200 acres of farmland outside Cedar Rapids, and their daughter Allison had been hosting these gatherings since we were 16. That night, there were maybe 12 of us sitting around the fire pit they'd built about 50 yards from where the corn started, passing around cheap beer and talking about nothing important, while sparks drifted up toward the stars. Allison had just turned 19 the week before, and she kept joking about how this might be our last real summer together before adult life swallowed us whole. Around 11 that night, Allison's phone slipped out of her hoodie pocket when she stood up to grab another drink from the cooler, and we all heard it hit something hard before bouncing into the darkness toward the cornfield. She laughed and said she'd be right back, turned on her phone's flashlight using Jess's phone to call hers so it would light up, and walked toward the edge of the corn where we could hear it buzzing. The stalks swallowed her immediately, but we could track her movement by the glow of the flashlight filtering through the corn, and her voice calling out that she could see it, just a little further in. Her friend Kayla was recording some stupid video for Instagram and actually caught Allison disappearing between the rows, this casual moment that would later become evidence. We kept talking and laughing, waiting for her to come back, but after maybe 3 or 4 minutes, her boyfriend Noah called out asking if she needed help, and that's when we realized we couldn't see the flashlight anymore or hear her moving through the stalks. Noah stood up first, cupping his hands around his mouth and shouting her name into the darkness, and the rest of us quickly joined him at the edge of the cornfield, our voices overlapping as we called for Allison. The corn seemed to absorb our shouts, muffling them into nothing, and all we could hear was our own breathing and the constant rustling of leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. 5 of us formed a line and walked into the field together, arms outstretched so we wouldn't lose each other, moving slowly through the rows while calling her name every few seconds. The stalks were so thick that even with our phone flashlights, we could only see maybe 2 feet ahead, and the leaves kept slapping against our faces and arms, leaving these thin scratches that stung with sweat. After 20 minutes of searching, we found her phone lying face down in the dirt between 2 rows. The screen cracked but still glowing with Jess's missed calls, and that's when the real panic set in because Allison would never leave her phone behind, not even as a joke. We spent the next 3 hours searching that field, our voices getting hoarse from screaming her name, stumbling through the endless rows until our phones started dying one by one. Noah was practically hyperventilating, convinced she'd fallen and hit her head somewhere, while Kayla kept insisting we should have heard something, anything, if Allison had gotten hurt or lost, because sound carries weird in cornfields, but it doesn't just disappear entirely. By 2 in the morning, someone finally convinced Noah to call 911, and within an hour, the place was swarming with sheriff's deputies, volunteer firefighters, and search and rescue teams with powerful floodlights that lit up sections of the field like daylight. They brought in thermal imaging equipment, thinking maybe she'd passed out somewhere in the corn, and 2 different K9 units that both tracked her scent about 30 feet into the field before losing it completely, which the handlers said almost never happens unless someone gets into a vehicle. The Brennans came out in their bathrobes, Allison's mother Claire collapsing against her husband when she realized her daughter wasn't just playing some elaborate prank, and the sound she made was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, this raw wail that seemed to echo across the entire property. When the sun came up around 6 that morning, they had over 50 people walking shoulder to shoulder through the cornfield in a grid pattern, marking each row with orange tape as they cleared it. That's when one of the deputies found the footprints, a single set of bare feet in the soft dirt that started about 40 feet from where we'd found the phone, which made no sense because Allison had been wearing these beat-up Converse sneakers with smiley faces she'd drawn on them in Sharpie. The prints were small, definitely hers based on the size, and they followed this bizarre path through the corn, weaving between rows seemingly at random, before making a sharp turn toward the gravel road that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The detective taking photos kept muttering about how clean the impressions were. No drag marks or signs of struggle. Just deliberate steps from someone who had apparently stopped to take off their shoes in the middle of a cornfield at night for no logical reason. They followed those prints for nearly a quarter mile, past the point where anyone at the bonfire could have possibly heard her, all the way to where the corn ended and the road began. At the edge of the road, the footprints simply stopped, right there in the middle of nothing. No car tracks in the gravel, no signs of anyone else having been there. Just this abrupt end like she'd stepped off the earth entirely. The forensics team photographed every print, measured the stride length, took soil samples, even brought in some specialist from the state police who'd worked missing persons cases for 20 years, and he stood there staring at those last few footprints for almost an hour without saying anything. Later, when the detective interviewed us individually at the station, he kept asking these specific questions about whether Allison had seemed different lately, whether she'd mentioned meeting anyone online, whether she'd ever talked about wanting to disappear, and it was clear they thought she'd planned this somehow. But those of us who knew her understood that was impossible, because Allison had just gotten accepted into the nursing program at the University of Iowa, had already paid her deposit, had spent the whole night talking about her classes starting in 2 weeks, and she'd never ever leave Noah without at least saying goodbye, not after they'd been together since sophomore year of high school. The thing that haunts me most happened 3 days after she disappeared, when the detective called us back to the station and showed us what they'd recovered from her phone. Most of it was normal stuff, texts about the bonfire, photos from earlier that night. But there was this recording that had started at 11:47 p.m., about 10 minutes after she'd walked into the corn, and it ran for nearly 2 hours before the battery died. The first few minutes were just rustling sounds and her breathing, normal enough, but then the breathing changed, became deeper and more rhythmic, like she was walking with purpose, and you could hear her moving through the corn at a steady pace, never stumbling or stopping to look around. About 30 minutes in, there was this weird moment where the rustling stopped completely for maybe 10 seconds. Total silence except for her breathing, and then it resumed, but with this strange echo quality, like she was in a much larger space than just between corn rows. The detective played it for us on these high-end speakers, and we all heard it, this subtle shift in the acoustic quality that made no sense given where she was supposed to be. The really disturbing part came near the end of the recording, around the 90-minute mark, when you could hear what sounded like Allison humming this tune none of us recognized, just 5 or 6 notes repeated over and over. And her breathing had become so calm, it was almost like she was in some kind of trance. Then right before the phone died, there was this sound that made everyone in that room lean forward. A voice that was definitely Allison's, but speaking in this flat, emotionless tone, saying numbers. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22. Just random numbers with no pattern anyone could figure out. The FBI got involved at that point, running the audio through every kind of analysis, checking those numbers against everything from GPS coordinates to dates to code sequences, but they found nothing that made sense. Noah listened to that recording probably 100 times, convinced there was some message in it, some clue we were missing, until his parents finally made him stop because he wasn't sleeping anymore, just sitting in his room with headphones on, playing those numbers over and over. 2 weeks later, they found her shoes, both of them, placed neatly side by side on the shoulder of Highway 30, almost 15 miles from the Brennan property, sitting there like she'd just stepped out of them to walk barefoot down the asphalt. They were definitely hers, those Converse with the smiley faces, and they were clean. No mud or corn silk or anything that suggested they'd been in that field, which made no sense because we'd all seen her wearing them that night. The laces were still tied in her specific way, This double knot she always did because she hated when they came undone. And inside the left shoe was a receipt from a gas station none of us had ever heard of. Time-stamped at 2:47 a.m. the night she disappeared, for a bottle of water and a pack of spearmint gum paid in cash. The detective drove out to that gas station, this little 24-hour place way out on some back road, and the night clerk remembered a girl matching Allison's description coming in around that time, but said she seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little quiet, and that she'd left on foot heading north even though he'd asked if she needed help finding something. What really messed with our heads was the security footage from that gas station, because it clearly showed Allison walking in at 2:46 a.m., barefoot and wearing the same clothes from the bonfire, moving with this strange, purposeful stride like she knew exactly where she was going. She bought the items, had a brief conversation with the clerk where she apparently told him she was going to see the Rose End, whatever that meant, and then walked out and turned north just like he'd said. The camera outside caught her walking along the edge of the road for about 30 seconds before she disappeared into the darkness, and that was the last confirmed sighting of her. The police searched every inch of ground between that gas station and where they'd found her shoes, brought in helicopters with infrared cameras, even drained a pond half a mile away, but found nothing else. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Allison had ever been anywhere near that stretch of highway. The investigation went on for months, with detectives following every possible lead, interviewing anyone who'd had contact with Allison in the weeks before she disappeared, checking traffic cameras from every intersection within a 50-mile radius, but they never found another trace of her. They discovered she'd been researching weird stuff online in the days before the bonfire, agricultural patterns, and something called liminality in rural spaces, which turned out to be some academic paper about psychological effects of repetitive landscapes like cornfields. But her browser history was otherwise normal, just college stuff and music videos. Her parents hired a private investigator who spent 6 months retracing every step, even brought in some expert on missing persons who'd worked cases all over the Midwest. But he just confirmed what we already knew. People don't just vanish like this, walking barefoot out of a cornfield in the middle of the night with no explanation, no motive, no destination that anyone could identify. The hardest part was watching the Brennans slowly accept that their daughter might never come home, seeing them take down the missing person flyers as they weathered and faded, watching Noah transfer to a different school because he couldn't handle being in Cedar Rapids anymore. The cornfield is still there, though the Brennans don't plant it anymore, just let it go wild with prairie grass and weeds that grow taller each summer until you can barely tell it was ever cultivated land. Sometimes I drive past on my way to visit Jess's parents, and I always slow down at that spot where the field meets the road, wondering if maybe I'll see something everyone else missed, some clue that explains where Allison went that night. The gas station clerk quit his job a few months after she disappeared. Said he kept having dreams about a girl walking north into the darkness, and the new clerk doesn't know anything about it, just shrugs when people ask about the girl who came through that night talking about Rose Ending. Noah sent me a message last month. First time I'd heard from him in over a year, just a simple question. Do you ever hear those numbers in your head? And I knew exactly what he meant because sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear Allison's flat voice reciting them. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22, like she's still out there somewhere, walking barefoot through endless rows of corn, following some path only she can see. Jamie always came home at 3:45, give or take 2 minutes. I'd been timing him since the start of the school year, mostly out of boredom while I waited for my shift at the hardware store to start at 5. My younger brother was 14 and predictable as clockwork. You could set your watch by the sound of him kicking off his sneakers on the back porch. October had settled over our part of Illinois with unusual cold that year, and the acres of corn behind our house had turned that particular shade of brown that meant harvest was overdue. That Wednesday, I stood at the kitchen window eating a sandwich, watching the clock tick past 4, then 4:30, and Jamie never showed. Mom was still at the dentist's office where she worked reception, and Dad wouldn't be back from the plant until after 7. By 5:15, I'd already called the school twice, walked the road to check for accidents, and finally forced myself to face what I'd been avoiding, checking the shortcut through the corn that Jamie had been using since 6th grade. My brother treated that field like his personal highway, cutting 20 minutes off his walk home every single day. He knew every deer trail, every irrigation pipe, every spot where the rows opened into small clearings. I found his entry point immediately, the same gap near the rusted fence post where he always ducked in, his handprints visible in the orange rust from years of grabbing it for balance. His footprints were fresh in the soft dirt, those beat-up Converse with the loose heel leaving their familiar marks. I followed them for about 30 yards before backing out and calling 911, trying to keep my voice steady while explaining that my brother hadn't come home. Within an hour, we had 3 sheriff's deputies tramping through our kitchen, tracking mud everywhere while Deputy Coleman explained his theory about spatial disorientation in tall crops. He said it like he was reading from a manual, like Jamie hadn't spent 4 years learning every landmark in those 200 acres, like my brother was some city kid who'd never seen corn before. They searched until midnight that first night, brought in dogs the next morning, even used a drone with thermal imaging on Friday. Nothing. The dogs tracked Jamie's scent for maybe 300 yards into the field before losing it completely, like he'd just vanished into thin air. The handler, a woman named Cheryl with deep wrinkles around her eyes, kept making her German Shepherd go back to the same spot, clearly frustrated that the trail just stopped. She asked me 3 times if there were any old wells or storm cellars in the field, and each time I told her no, just corn and dirt and more corn. The thermal drone picked up plenty of deer, a few coyotes, but no heat signature that could be Jamie. Sheriff Garrett held a press conference on Saturday talking about ongoing search efforts, while basically telling everyone that kids sometimes run away, that the corn made it hard to find anyone, that we needed to consider all possibilities. Mom stopped sleeping after that, just sat at the kitchen table staring at Jamie's school photo, while Dad drove around checking abandoned barns and talking to farmers within a 10-mile radius. By Monday, a week after Jamie disappeared, the official search was scaled back to routine patrols. I couldn't stand the waiting anymore, couldn't stand how everyone was starting to talk about my brother in past tense. That morning after my parents left, Mom to put up more flyers, Dad to check the bus station in Peoria again, I went back to the field alone. The cops had trampled the original trail, but I knew Jamie's patterns well enough to guess his likely route. He always veered left after entering the field, following a slight ridge that kept his feet drier when the ground was muddy. I pushed through the corn, ignoring how the dry leaves cut at my arms, counting my paces like Jamie had taught me when we were kids playing hide and seek. At around 400 yards in, well past where the dogs had lost his scent, I found something the searchers had missed, a partial footprint, just the toe of his Converse preserved under a fallen cornstalk. The angle was wrong though, like he'd been walking backwards or spinning around, and the dirt around it had strange marks, almost like something had been dragged, but not quite. I kept following the disturbed earth, crawling on my knees now to see under the bent stalks, and that's when I spotted it. Jamie's backpack sitting perfectly upright against a cornstalk like someone had carefully placed it there. Not thrown, not dropped, but set down deliberately with the zippers all closed and the straps adjusted evenly. My brother was messy, always tossing his stuff around, never zipped anything properly in his life. The backpack was clean too, no dirt or moisture on it despite sitting there for a week. Inside, everything was arranged wrong. His textbooks stacked by size, his pencils all facing the same direction in their case, his half-eaten bag of chips folded closed and paper-clipped. Jamie didn't even own paper clips. About 10 feet away, positioned exactly parallel to the corn rows, I found his left shoe. Just one shoe, laces still tied in Jamie's weird double-knot style, but the shoe itself was pristine, like someone had wiped it clean before placing it there. The sock was tucked inside, folded into a perfect little square. The trail of disturbed soil continued for another 20 yards past the shoe, and I followed it, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the wind rattling the corn. The marks in the dirt were deliberate, not random drag patterns, but almost like symbols or letters, though I couldn't make sense of them. They led to a small clearing where several corn stalks had been bent down in a rough circle, their tops woven together overhead to form a kind of shelter or blind. Inside this space, the ground was completely smooth, swept clean of any debris or footprints. In the exact center, someone had dug a shallow depression, maybe 6 inches deep and perfectly round. The extracted dirt formed into a neat ring around it. At the bottom of the depression lay Jamie's student ID card, his house key, and 3 pennies from his pocket, arranged in a triangle. The plastic ID wasn't scratched or dirty. It looked like someone had polished it. But what made me stumble backward was what I saw pressed into the smooth dirt around these items. Dozens of footprints, all from the same shoe, all exactly the same depth, forming a spiral pattern that wound inward to the center. They were Jamie's prints from his right shoe, the one still on his foot. I ran back to the house, crashing through the corn rows without caring about the cuts on my arms, and called Sheriff Garrett directly. This time I had evidence, something concrete they couldn't dismiss as teenage runaway behavior. Garrett himself came out with 2 detectives from the state police, and I led them to the clearing, my legs shaking the whole way. They took photos of everything, bagged the items, made casts of the footprints, but I could see the confusion on their faces. Detective Mills kept asking if I was sure I hadn't touched anything, if maybe Jamie had made this himself as some kind of prank or cry for attention. I wanted to scream at him that Jamie wasn't that kind of kid, that someone had taken my brother and arranged his things like trophies. They brought in a forensics team that afternoon, and that's when things got even stranger. The footprint spiral showed Jamie had walked it at least 30 times, based on the depth and overlap, but there were no other prints anywhere, not even partials. Whoever had been with him had either never touched the ground or had carefully erased their tracks while leaving Jamie's intact. The forensics tech, a young guy named Bradley who looked fresh from college, pulled me aside while the others were documenting the scene. He showed me something on his tablet, enhanced photos of the dirt marks I'd thought might be symbols. Under magnification, they weren't random at all. They were measurements, precise distances marked in the soil, all pointing to different spots in the field. Bradley had mapped them, and they formed a grid pattern extending out from the clearing in perfectly straight lines, each endpoint exactly 150 feet from the center. He asked if Jamie was good at math, if he might have been interested in surveying or geometry. I told him Jamie could barely pass algebra, that he couldn't measure anything without messing it up. Bradley just nodded and went back to the others, but I saw him taking more photos, making notes in a separate notebook he didn't share with the detectives. Before they left, he slipped me a piece of paper with his number, told me to call if I found anything else, anything at all that seemed arranged or measured. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the grid pattern Bradley had shown me. After my parents went to bed, Mom finally knocked out by sleeping pills, Dad passed out on the couch still wearing his work boots. I grabbed a compass and measuring tape from the garage and went back to the field. The moon was nearly full, giving just enough light to navigate between the corn rows without a flashlight that might alert the neighbors. I found the clearing again and started checking Bradley's measurements, following the grid lines out to their endpoints. At the first marker, exactly 150 feet north of the clearing, I found another small depression in the ground, this one containing Jamie's calculator watch, the band cut cleanly in half. The second point to the east had his gym whistle on its lanyard, tied in a complex knot I'd never seen before. Each endpoint had something of Jamie's, all items he would have had with him that day, all placed with the same obsessive precision. The western point made me stop breathing for a full 10 seconds. There, arranged in a perfect line, were Jamie's baby teeth, the ones Mom had saved in a little box in her jewelry drawer. All 12 of them, spaced exactly 1 inch apart, pressed into the soil so only their tops were visible. How could anyone have known about those teeth? How could they have gotten into our house, into Mom's room, without us noticing? I started digging frantically around the teeth, my fingers clawing at the dirt, and about 6 inches down, I hit something solid. It was Jamie's phone, wrapped in clear plastic. The screen still showing his last text to me from that Wednesday. Home in 20. Save me some pizza. The battery was dead, but the phone was perfectly clean inside its wrapping, like someone had sealed it away for safekeeping. Underneath the phone, pressed into the clay, was a single adult footprint. Not a shoe print, but a bare foot, with unusually long toes, and what looked like a sixth toe's impression on the left side. The print was deep, deeper than my own when I stood next to it, suggesting someone much heavier despite the narrow shape of the foot. I called Bradley from the field, whispering into my phone while crouched in the corn. He answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting for my call. And when I told him about the baby teeth and the footprint, he went silent for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then he told me to take photos of everything but not to call the sheriff yet. He said he'd been doing some research, checking through old missing persons cases in the area, and he'd found something. 3 other kids had vanished in cornfields over the past 15 years, all within a 50-mile radius, all in October, all between the ages of 12 and 15. The cases had never been connected because they happened in different counties, different jurisdictions, but the pattern was there. Each time the official search found nothing, dogs lost the trail, and the kids were written off as runaways. Bradley had driven out to one of the old sites that afternoon, a field near Effingham that had since been developed into a subdivision. The construction crew had found strange things when they cleared the land. Items arranged in geometric patterns, footprints that didn't match any of the workers, and according to one foreman Bradley had tracked down, a complex tunnel system that didn't appear on any survey maps. The southern grid point was the last one I checked, and I almost wished I hadn't. There, in a shallow hole covered with carefully arranged corn husks, was a stack of photographs. They were all of Jamie, taken over the course of months, maybe years. Jamie walking to school, Jamie in our backyard, Jamie through his bedroom window. Some were so recent I recognized the clothes, the shirt he'd worn the previous week, the jacket he'd gotten for his birthday in September. But others were older, showing Jamie at 12, at 10, even one that looked like it was taken when he was maybe 7 or 8, at a school field day I barely remembered. Whoever had taken these had been watching my brother for half his life, had been in our neighborhood, near our house, close enough to photograph him through windows. At the bottom of the stack was a hand-drawn map of our property and the cornfield, marked with dates and times, noting Jamie's routes and routines with terrifying accuracy. The final notation, written in small, precise handwriting, was for that Wednesday, 3:15 p.m., intercept at position 7. Position 7 was marked deep in the field, right around where the dogs had lost Jamie's scent. Bradley arrived at the field 40 minutes later with ground-penetrating radar equipment he'd borrowed from the university. We worked in silence, scanning the area around position 7. And just before dawn, the equipment detected an anomaly. A void about 8 feet underground, extending horizontally for at least 20 feet before the signal degraded. Bradley called in favors, got a full FBI team out there by noon. Told them about the pattern of disappearances, the photographs, everything. They brought in excavation equipment, and by evening they'd broken through into a narrow tunnel, hand-dug and reinforced with scavenged materials, leading to a series of small chambers carved from the clay. The smell that came up from that hole, earth and something else, something organic and wrong, made everyone step back. The FBI sent in a robot with a camera first, and when they saw what was down there, they cleared everyone out except essential personnel. They found Jamie alive in the 3rd chamber, semi-conscious and dehydrated but breathing, along with 2 other kids, a girl from Champaign who'd gone missing 3 weeks earlier, and a boy from Decatur whose parents had reported him as a runaway 6 days ago. The man they arrested lived alone in a farmhouse 4 miles away, had worked as a surveyor for the county 20 years ago, before an injury left him on disability. Harold Jenks, 63 years old, 6'4", with a birth defect that gave him an extra toe on his left foot. He'd been using the tunnel system for over a decade, expanding it each year, accessing it through hidden entrances in 3 different cornfields. The FBI found journals in his house, thousands of pages documenting his observations of children, his selection process, his careful planning. He wrote about keeping them underground during the harvest season, when the noise of machinery would mask any sounds, then moving them through the tunnels to different locations, always staying ahead of the searches. Jamie doesn't remember much. Jenks had drugged him with something that affected his memory, made him compliant enough to walk that spiral pattern over and over, while Jenks watched from a blind he'd built in the corn. The other kids had similar gaps in their memories, just fragments of darkness and the sound of corn rustling overhead. Jenks pleaded guilty to avoid trial, got life without parole, and never explained why he did it beyond saying the fields told him to. Jamie came home after a week in the hospital, physically okay but different, quieter. He hasn't walked through a cornfield since, takes the long way to school now, stays on the sidewalks and paved roads. The field behind our house was harvested that November, and Dad convinced the owner to plant soybeans the next year, then wheat, anything but corn. We never talk about it, but sometimes I catch Jamie staring out his bedroom window at where the cornfield used to be, and I wonder what he's remembering, what fragments of those dark hours underground still surface in his dreams. The fence posts stretched for miles across that Nebraska property, each one needing new wire, or a complete replacement after the spring storms had torn through. I'd been picking up mechanic work at a shop in Omaha for about 6 months, when Jerry, one of the regulars, mentioned his uncle needed someone handy for a week-long job out in the country. The pay was double what I was making, cash up front, plus room and board at the farmhouse. My beat-up Chevy truck needed new tires and the rent was overdue, so I loaded my tools that Sunday morning and drove 3 hours west into nowhere. The land out there was different than anything I'd seen growing up near Denver, just endless fields of corn already standing 7 feet tall in early July, broken only by gravel roads that seemed to lead nowhere special. Walter Hoffman turned out to be somewhere past 70, with fingers bent from arthritis, and a way of squinting at you like he was trying to read fine print. His farmhouse sat alone on 800 acres, the nearest neighbor a good 4 miles down the county road. He showed me to a small room above the garage, just a mattress and a dresser that smelled like motor oil, then walked me along the fence line that needed fixing. The corn grew right up to the posts in most places, leaving these narrow corridors where I'd have to work, barely wide enough to swing a hammer. Walter said he'd planted late this year because of the rain, and the stalks were growing fast in the heat, already thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows. He'd leave me alone during the day, he explained, since his hip made walking hard, but dinner would be ready at 6 sharp in the main house. The first 3 days went smooth enough, just me and the fence posts under that Nebraska sun, sweat dripping while I hammered new boards and stretched wire until my arms burned. The only sounds were the meadowlarks calling from somewhere beyond the corn and this constant rustling the wind made pushing through all those leaves. Sometimes I'd catch myself stopping work just to listen to it, that ocean sound of thousands of stalks swaying together, almost hypnotic if you let it get to you. Around Wednesday afternoon, I was working a section near the back of the property when I heard something else mixed in with that rustling. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, moving through the rows about 20 yards from where I was kneeling with my pliers. I stood up and called out, thinking maybe Walter had walked out to check on my progress, but the footsteps stopped immediately, leaving just that endless whisper of corn moving in the breeze. That night at dinner, I asked Walter if anyone else ever came through the property, maybe hunters or kids from town looking for trouble. He stopped cutting his pork chop and gave me that squinting look again, like I'd asked something peculiar. Nobody had any business being on his land, he said, and nobody from town would drive all the way out here just to walk through corn. The way he said it made me feel stupid for asking, so I dropped it and focused on my plate. But when I was walking back to my room above the garage, I noticed how complete the darkness was out there. No street lights, no house lights except Walter's windows, just stars and the massive shadow of the cornfield surrounding everything. My truck sat parked by the garage, and on impulse I tried starting it just to hear the engine. But when I turned the key, Nothing happened except a clicking sound from under the hood. The battery was dead, completely drained even though I'd just driven it 3 days ago without any problems. I popped the hood with my phone flashlight since the garage had no overhead light, and everything looked normal. No loose cables, no corrosion on the terminals. I figured I'd ask Walter for a jump in the morning, but when I checked my phone to set an alarm, the screen showed no signal bars at all. Not even one. I'd had at least 2 bars the first day, enough to text my roommate that I'd arrived safely. Now the phone was basically a brick, useless except as a flashlight. Standing there between my dead truck and that wall of corn just 30 feet away, I felt this weight settle in my chest, like when you realize you've made a mistake but can't quite name what it is yet. The corn rustled louder in the night breeze, and I swear I heard those same measured footsteps again, closer this time, maybe just inside the first row of stalks. Friday morning came with fog so thick I couldn't see the cornfield from my window, just white mist pressed against the glass like cotton. I found Walter in his kitchen already drinking coffee, and when I mentioned my truck trouble, he said his battery charger had broken last month, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. The nearest auto parts store was in town, 40 minutes away, and he couldn't drive me there until Monday, when he did his supply run. 3 more days stuck here. I asked about using his landline to call someone, maybe Jerry back in Omaha, but Walter said the phone lines went down in the last storm, and the phone company hadn't come out yet. His words made sense, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, like he'd been expecting these exact questions. I spent that day working the fence, but now every sound from the corn made me stop and stare into those green walls, trying to see between the stalks. That Friday night changed everything. I was lying on the mattress above the garage, windows open because the heat was suffocating when I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't staying in the corn. They were moving along the fence line I'd been repairing, slow and deliberate, occasionally stopping right where I'd been working hours before. I crept to the window and looked down, but the darkness was absolute beyond the small circle of light from Walter's porch bulb. Then I heard the fence wire snap, that distinct metallic twang of tension releasing, followed by another snap, then another. Someone was cutting through my work, destroying what I'd spent days fixing. I grabbed my phone for light and rushed downstairs, but by the time I reached the fence, the footsteps had retreated back into the corn. 3 sections of new wire hung loose, cleanly cut with what must have been wire cutters. The cuts were precise, deliberate, not random vandalism, but something purposeful. Walter barely looked up from his eggs when I told him Saturday morning about the cut fence. Kids from town, he said, probably the same ones who'd been stealing gas from farms all summer. But his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee mug, and I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows that faced the cornfield. I spent the morning repairing the damaged sections, jumping at every rustle, every bird call. Around noon, I decided to walk the perimeter of the property, looking for tire tracks or footprints, anything that might explain who was doing this. The corn rows ran along 3 sides of Walter's land, with only the front facing the county road clear. As I walked along the eastern edge, where the stalks grew thickest, I found something that made me stop cold. A narrow path cut into the corn, barely visible unless you were looking straight at it. The stalks had been carefully pushed aside, not broken, creating a tunnel that disappeared into the green darkness. Fresh boot prints marked the entrance, the treads still sharp in the dry soil. I stood at that entrance for a long time, listening to the corn move around me, trying to convince myself to follow that path and see where it led. But something primal in my gut screamed against it. Whoever made that trail knew these fields, had probably been using them for weeks or months, maybe longer. They could be waiting in there just far enough in where the light barely reached, watching the entrance. Instead, I backed away and continued my circuit around the property, finding 2 more hidden paths cut into different sections of the field. All of them angled toward the house and garage, like spokes on a wheel with Walter's buildings at the center. That afternoon, I confronted Walter directly, told him about the paths, said someone was definitely living or hiding in his corn. His face went pale, almost gray, and he gripped the kitchen table hard enough that his knuckles went white. Then he told me something that made everything worse. The corn wasn't his. He'd leased those fields to a company 5 years ago, some agricultural outfit from Kansas City, and they planted and harvested without his involvement. He had no idea who worked those fields or when they came through. Saturday night, I barricaded myself in the room above the garage, pushing the dresser against the door and keeping a hammer within reach. Sleep was impossible. Every sound became footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like breathing. Around midnight, I heard voices, low, muffled, but definitely human, coming from somewhere near the garage. I pressed my ear to the floor and could make out at least 2 different speakers, maybe 3, but couldn't understand the words. They were directly below me in the garage with my dead truck. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then footsteps scattered in different directions, some heading back toward the corn, others moving toward the main house where Walter slept. I watched from my window as a shadow passed through the porch light's glow, tall, wearing what looked like coveralls, carrying something long in one hand. The figure stopped at Walter's front door, stood there for a full minute, then walked back toward the cornfield, disappearing into one of those hidden paths. Sunday morning, Walter wasn't in the kitchen at his usual time. I found him sitting on his porch, staring at the cornfield with hollow eyes, looking like he hadn't slept at all. When I sat down beside him, he started talking without prompting, his voice barely above a whisper. The company that leased his fields, he said. They'd stopped sending checks 2 years ago, stopped answering his calls, but people still came to work the corn. Different people each season, arriving in unmarked vans, never talking to him, never asking permission. He'd tried calling the police once, but the sheriff said without proof of trespassing or crime, there was nothing to investigate. The workers had keys to the equipment shed behind the corn, legal access roads through neighboring properties. Walter suspected they were growing more than corn in those fields, using the dense rows to hide other activities. Maybe drugs, maybe worse. He'd been too scared to look closer, too old to fight back, so he just stayed in his house and pretended not to notice when they came through at night. I told Walter we were leaving immediately, both of us that morning. We could walk to the county road and flag down a car if we had to. But he shook his head, said they'd never let us leave on foot, not in daylight when they could see us from the corn. Our only chance was his truck Monday morning, acting like nothing was wrong, like it was just his regular supply run. Until then, we had to play along, pretend we didn't know anything. That Sunday crawled by in suffocating tension, both of us going through the motions, me pretending to work on the fence, Walter puttering around his yard, both of us avoiding looking at the corn even as we felt eyes watching from within. As darkness fell, Walter handed me his truck keys and an old revolver he'd kept hidden. Only 3 bullets left in the cylinder. He told me to be ready at dawn, to get to his truck fast when he gave the signal. We'd make a run for town and never come back. That night they came for my truck. I watched from my window as 4 figures emerged from different paths in the corn, converging on the garage below. They worked in complete silence, no talking, just efficient movement as they pushed my truck out of the garage and down toward the cornfield. They were taking it somewhere into those rows, probably to strip it for parts or hide it where no one would ever find it. One of them looked up at my window before they disappeared, just stood there staring at where I was hiding behind the curtain, making sure I knew they knew exactly where I was. I gripped Walter's revolver tighter and waited for them to come upstairs, but after a few minutes the figure turned and followed the others into the corn. The message was clear. We were allowed to leave in the morning, but only because they decided to let us go. They owned this place now, not Walter, and everyone involved understood the terms. Monday came with a blood-red sunrise that painted the corn stalks orange. Walter was already in his truck when I sprinted from the garage, expecting someone to emerge from the fields at any moment. But nothing moved except the corn swaying in the morning breeze. We drove down that gravel drive faster than was safe, dust clouding behind us, neither of us speaking until we hit the paved county road. Walter drove straight to the state police station in Grand Island, told them everything while I sat there still clutching his revolver in my jacket pocket. The cops sent units out that afternoon, but they found nothing. No paths in the corn, no footprints, no sign of my truck. Even the cut fence wires had been replaced with new ones. The detective said without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Walter sold the farm 2 months later to some development company from out of state, took whatever they offered and moved to Arizona to live with his daughter. I never got my truck back. Never got paid for the fence work either. Sometimes I search online for news about that area of Nebraska, looking for stories about drug busts or missing persons found in cornfields. But there's never anything. Whatever they were doing out there in those endless rows, they're probably still doing it now, using some other old farmer's land, watching from the corn. October brings out the worst in people, and after working at Frightland Farms for 6 weeks, I thought I'd seen it all. College was draining my bank account faster than my parents predicted, so when I saw the Help Wanted sign for the corn maze back in September, $30 an hour seemed too good to pass up. The maze sprawled across 12 acres of farmland just outside Bakersfield, with walls of corn stalks reaching 8 feet high, and paths that twisted into dead ends designed to make visitors panic. My job was simple enough. Reset the motion-activated props between tours, guide lost families to the exit, and make sure nobody vandalized the animatronic scarecrows. That particular Saturday night, we'd run 7 tours back-to-back, each one packed with screaming teenagers and drunk adults who thought jumping out at other guests was hilarious. By the time we locked the main gate at midnight, my ears were ringing from all the chainsaw sound effects, and dried corn silk had worked its way into every piece of clothing I wore. The parking lot emptied out quickly after closing, leaving just 3 cars: mine, the manager Keith's pickup truck, and a sedan that belonged to Vicky from concessions. Keith had asked me and 2 other guys to stay late for breakdown duty, promising an extra $50 cash if we helped haul the expensive decorations into storage before the rain forecasted for Sunday morning. Most of the electronic stuff needed to come down first: the strobe lights, fog machines, and those motion sensors that triggered recorded screams whenever someone walked past. The other guys started at the entrance while I headed toward the back sections with a wheelbarrow and my phone flashlight, since the overhead lights would shut off automatically at 12:30 to save electricity. The corn rustled in the wind, creating whispers that made me jumpy even though I knew every inch of these paths. I just disconnected the zombie mannequin at checkpoint 4 when the first section of lights went dark, way earlier than scheduled. Then the second section cut out, and the third like someone was flipping breakers in sequence, leaving me stranded in complete darkness, with nothing but my phone's weak beam cutting through the shadows. "Keith," I called out, expecting to hear his gravelly voice boom back from the entrance, but nothing came except the sound of corn stalks brushing against each other. The generator should have kicked in by now. We had backup power specifically for situations like this, installed after some kids got lost in the dark 2 years ago, and their parents threatened to sue. I tried calling Keith's cell, but the screen showed no signal, which wasn't unusual since reception was spotty out here, but the timing made my chest tight. That's when I heard it, a voice answering from somewhere deep in the maze, muffled by the walls of corn but definitely human. "Yeah, coming," it said, but something was wrong with the tone, too high-pitched to be Keith, too cheerful for anyone who'd just worked a 12-hour shift. The voice had that fake quality actors use when they're trying too hard to sound casual, like someone reading lines for the first time. I aimed my phone toward where the sound came from, but the light barely penetrated 5 feet before the darkness swallowed it whole. My first instinct was to head back toward the entrance, but the path behind me looked identical to the one ahead, just walls of corn pressing in from both sides. We'd designed the maze to disorient people during daylight hours, and now, in pitch darkness with my phone battery at 30%, every turn looked the same. Another sound cut through the rustling, and this time it was definitely laughter. Not from the speakers we'd installed at corner posts, but from somewhere between the rows, like someone was standing just behind the corn wall next to me. The laugh had that unhinged quality drunk people get when they think they're being funny, but they're really just being creepy. drawn out, and ending in a wheeze. "Real hilarious, guys," I shouted, figuring it was probably Brett and Miguel trying to mess with me, but my voice cracked halfway through. The laughter stopped immediately, replaced by footsteps, not on the packed dirt paths but pushing through the corn itself, snapping stalks as whoever it was forced their way through the walls instead of using the maze routes. The wheelbarrow I'd been pushing sat abandoned behind me somewhere, and I couldn't remember which checkpoint I'd passed last. Every horror movie I'd ever watched screamed at me not to investigate, to just run, but running blind through a maze designed to trap people seemed equally stupid. My phone flashlight started flickering, not dying completely but stuttering like a strobe light, which made the shadows between the corn rows jump and dance. During one of the dark moments, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving parallel to me through the stalks, keeping pace but never quite showing itself fully. The smell hit me then, not the earthy scent of corn and soil I'd gotten used to, but something chemical and wrong, like rubber burning mixed with that sickly sweet stench of spilled energy drinks. Whoever this was had been here a while, maybe since before we opened for the evening tours, waiting in some corner we never checked. The thought made bile rise in my throat because we'd had hundreds of people walk through here tonight, including families with little kids, and this person had been watching the whole time. I forced myself to think logically about the maze layout. The exit was always northeast from any point. That's how we'd mapped it for emergency situations. But without the overhead lights or the glowing arrows we put up for the younger kids' tours, northeast meant nothing. The footsteps had stopped, which somehow felt worse than hearing them because now I had no idea where the person was. Then my phone started ringing, the sound impossibly loud in the silence, Keith's name lighting up the screen. Relief flooded through me as I answered, but the voice that came through wasn't Keith's. "Having fun yet?" the same high-pitched voice from earlier asked, and I realized with cold certainty that whoever was in here with me had Keith's phone. The line went dead before I could respond, and when I looked at my screen, my battery had dropped to 20%, even though it had been at 30 just minutes ago. The corn to my left suddenly parted, stalks bending outward like something large was pushing through, and I saw fingers, too long with dirt caked under the nails, reaching through the gap toward where I stood. I stumbled backward and ran, not caring anymore about finding the exit, just needing to put distance between me and those reaching fingers. The maze paths forked and twisted, and I took turns at random, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the corn walls. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not running but walking steadily, calmly, like whoever it was knew exactly where I would end up. They started whistling, the tune familiar but wrong, like a children's song played in a minor key. My phone light caught a reflection ahead, metal gleaming in the darkness, and I recognized one of our emergency exit signs, the ones we installed after the lawsuit threat. The gate was padlocked, of course, but the fence was only 6 feet high, chain link that I could climb if I could just reach it. 20 more yards, 15, 10, and then something wrapped around my ankle, sending me sprawling face first into the dirt path. When I rolled over, gasping and spitting out soil, I saw what had tripped me. A foam machete from one of our props, but attached to it was a note written in what looked like brown marker. "You walked past me 17 times tonight." The whistling had stopped, and in the sudden quiet, I heard something that made my situation infinitely worse. Multiple voices, at least 3, maybe 4, all whispering in unison from different parts of the maze. They were coordinating, I realized, using the paths to herd me towards something. My phone finally died, plunging me into absolute darkness just as I heard the chain link fence rattle somewhere to my right. They were climbing it, blocking my escape route. The whispering grew louder and I could make out words now. "Section 3 clear. He's moving toward checkpoint 7. Block the maintenance gate." These weren't random creeps who'd hidden after hours. They'd studied our maze, learned our procedures, maybe even taken one of our employee maps from the break room. The smell was stronger now, and I realized why it seemed familiar. It was the same combination of smells from the storage unit where we kept the old decorations, the ones from 5 years ago when an employee named Curtis had disappeared during breakdown and never been found. We joked about it sometimes, called it the Curtis curse, but right now, crouched in the dirt with strangers surrounding me, I wondered if maybe Curtis hadn't disappeared at all. The ground beneath me vibrated slightly, and I heard the unmistakable sound of our industrial wood chipper starting up somewhere near the maintenance shed. We used it to mulch the corn stalks after the season ended, but hearing it now, in the dark with these people hunting me, sent ice through my veins. They weren't just trying to scare me. They had access to our equipment, knew where we kept the keys. A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness about 50 feet away, sweeping back and forth methodically. And in its glow, I saw a figure wearing one of our employee uniforms from years ago. The old green ones we'd replaced with red ones 3 seasons back. The person holding the light was tall, skeletal thin, with hair that hung in greasy strands over their face. When they turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of their smile, too wide, showing too many teeth like they'd been practicing it in a mirror but couldn't quite get it right. "Found you," they sang out in that high-pitched voice, and 2 more flashlights clicked on from different directions, forming a triangle with me at the center. Something inside me snapped then, not breaking but hardening into pure survival instinct. I grabbed handful after handful of dirt and started throwing it at the nearest flashlight, then dove through the corn wall to my left, not caring about the stalks cutting my face and arms. The corn rows weren't planted in perfect lines. There were gaps if you knew where to look, spaces where the irrigation system created natural corridors. I'd spent 6 weeks learning every inch of this place, and now that knowledge was the only thing keeping me alive. Behind me, I heard them crashing through the corn, no longer coordinated, angry now. The wood chipper's sound grew louder as I headed toward it, which seemed insane, but I remembered something. The maintenance shed had a landline, an old phone that connected directly to the security company. If I could get there first, if I could lock myself in and make that call, maybe I'd survive this. The shed appeared in the darkness, a darker shadow against the night sky, and I could see the door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. The smart thing would be to avoid it, to know it was a trap, but I could hear them getting closer, and the sound of the wood chipper meant someone was already there, waiting. I burst through the shed door and immediately saw Keith, tied to a chair with orange extension cords, duct tape over his mouth, his eyes wide with terror, but alive. The wood chipper sat in the corner, running empty, just making noise to lure me here. Before I could move toward Keith, the door slammed shut behind me, and the skeletal figure stepped out from behind a stack of fertilizer bags. Up close, I could see their face clearly. Hollow cheeks, eyes that didn't blink enough, and that horrible smile that looked carved into their face. "You lasted longer than Curtis," they said in that sing-song voice, pulling something from their pocket that gleamed silver in the dim light from the emergency exit sign. It was a set of keys. Car keys, house keys, and smaller keys I recognized as the ones from our employee lockers. Dozens of sets, all on different rings, some rusty, some new, and I understood with sickening clarity that Curtis wasn't there first, and I wouldn't be there last. They took a step toward me, and I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a canister of pesticide spray we used for wasp nests. The label warned about eye contact, about permanent damage, about keeping away from open flames, and I remembered the lighter in my pocket from my smoke break 6 hours ago, back when my biggest worry was a statistics midterm. What happened next took maybe 10 seconds, but I can still see every detail when I close my eyes. I sprayed the pesticide directly at their face while flicking the lighter with my other hand, creating a makeshift flamethrower that sent them stumbling backward, screaming in a voice that finally sounded human. The others burst through the door just as the pesticide canister emptied, and in the chaos, I managed to cut Keith free with a box cutter from the workbench. We ran toward his truck while they tried to help their leader, whose face was a mess of chemical burns and singed hair. Keith's hands shook so badly I had to dig the keys from his pocket myself, and we peeled out of there, gravel spraying, while 3 figures stood in the parking lot watching us go. The police found evidence of at least 12 different people who'd gone missing from corn mazes across 3 states over the past 8 years, all during the Halloween season. They arrested 4 people living in an abandoned farmhouse 2 miles from Frightland Farms, and during the trial, we learned they'd been employees at various mazes over the years, learning layouts, studying procedures, choosing victims who stayed late. The wood chipper had been cleaned with bleach so many times the metal was pitted, but forensics still found traces. I finished college, got my degree, moved to Portland where there's no farmland for miles, but every October when the leaves change and people start decorating for Halloween, I smell that mixture of burnt rubber and energy drinks, and I remember those fingers reaching through the corn. The Corn Maze Festival had always been the highlight of autumn in our town. Families came from neighboring counties to eat fried dough, take hay rides, and get lost among the tall golden rows that stretched beyond the church steeple. I helped with parking that year, waving cars toward the muddy field behind the grain silo. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend. Warm cider, local bands, kids running with flashlights through the stalks. No one imagined that before the night was over, a 17-year-old named Tyler Green would vanish without a trace. I remember hearing his name for the first time over the loudspeaker. The announcer's voice cracked halfway through, like he did not quite believe what he was saying. People laughed at first, thinking it was a prank. Tyler had entered the maze around 6 in the evening with 3 friends, and by dusk, he had separated from them. They assumed he went out another exit, but when the fireworks started at 9, his parents realized he was not anywhere near the crowd. That is when the panic began to spread through the fairgrounds, quiet at first, like wind stirring the stalks before a storm. By midnight, the sheriff's deputies had blocked the roads leading to the farms, and volunteers were forming lines at the edge of the maze. I joined them, holding a lantern borrowed from my father's shed. The smell of wet earth and gasoline filled the air. Every few yards, someone shouted Tyler's name, and the sound was swallowed by the corn. Flashlights danced through the fog, catching glimpses of scarecrows, boots half buried in mud, and once, a child's lost mitten that made a woman scream before realizing it was pink, not blue like Tyler's. The search stretched into the early hours, and the field began to feel endless. When the sun rose, we saw how far we had wandered. The maze sat between 3 farms, their property lines marked by rusted wire and piles of rotting hay. A man named Roger Jenkins brought coffee in a thermos and pointed to tire tracks near the drainage ditch. He said they were fresh, still pressed deep into the mud from the night before. The sheriff crouched beside them, tracing the pattern with a stick, and his face tightened. Word spread fast that the tread matched a pickup belonging to Tyler's neighbor, a quiet mechanic named Paul Hewitt. By noon, no one was talking about an accident anymore. The sheriff questioned Paul right there at the field, his wife standing behind him, arms folded tight against the morning chill. Paul kept saying he had gone home early, that his truck had not left the driveway since supper time. But everyone in town knew his tires. He used a distinctive snow tread year-round, claiming it gave him better traction in mud. While deputies searched his property, the rest of us stayed behind, combing through the maze row by row. Around mid-afternoon, one of the volunteer teams radioed that they had found a roll of duct tape half buried under a pile of stalks. It looked like it had been torn in a hurry, silver edges still sticky with dirt and grass. After that, everything changed. The fairgrounds that had been filled with chatter went dead silent, except for the sound of engines starting as more people joined the search. The duct tape was placed in a plastic bag and carried toward the sheriff's car like it was made of glass. A deputy muttered something about fingerprints and another pointed toward a broken flashlight lying a few yards away. Someone swore they had seen that same brand in Paul's garage last week. By then, everyone's face had turned pale, and whispers replaced words. It felt as if the entire town was holding its breath, afraid of what would come next. Later that evening, the sky turned a strange amber color, the kind you see before heavy rain. The wind made the corn hiss and shift, creating shapes that looked like people moving between the rows. We kept walking in lines, calling Tyler's name, but it started to sound meaningless. Some of the older men brought dogs, though the animals refused to go near the northern edge of the field. That was where we found the torn piece of blue fabric caught on a barbed wire fence. It matched the color of the hoodie Tyler had been wearing. The air around us felt heavy, and no one said a word as the sheriff wrapped it in another evidence bag. When night came again, the searchlights turned the field into a sea of shadows. The sheriff ordered everyone back to the fairgrounds to regroup, but a few of us stayed behind near the drainage ditch, where the tire marks had been found. That was when Roger noticed something in the water, a small silver chain tangled around a branch. It had a pendant shaped like a baseball, and Tyler's mother confirmed later that it belonged to him. The sheriff looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him. He said they would start digging near the ditch at first light. I went home that night muddy to my knees, but I could not bring myself to wash my boots. When dawn came, the air was thick with fog. Deputies marked off a wide area near the ditch and brought in shovels. A local news van arrived, its camera catching every movement. I stood behind the barrier tape with a few others, unable to leave. After about 20 minutes, one of the deputies called for the sheriff. They had uncovered something wrapped in a tarp, small, dark, and unmistakably human-shaped. The sheriff told the reporters to turn off their cameras, but everyone already knew. A woman behind me began sobbing, and someone else yelled that Paul should be dragged out of his house that instant. Paul was taken into custody that afternoon, though no one saw the evidence they had against him. His wife packed their belongings that same evening and drove away without saying goodbye to anyone. For a few weeks, the town lived in a fog of suspicion. Neighbors stopped talking to each other. Parents refused to let their kids walk alone, and even the church potluck was canceled. The sheriff said the investigation was still ongoing, but no charges were ever filed. People whispered that something about the evidence did not add up, that the tire marks might have been a coincidence. Still, no one dared to question the official story too loudly. Months passed, and the cornfields grew bare again. The festival was canceled the following year, replaced by a simple memorial service near the ditch. I stood there, watching the wind move through the dry stalks, and realized how quiet everything had become. It was not just grief. It was fear. Fear that someone still among us had done it. Fear that we might never really know. Sometimes when I drive past that field at night, I see flashlights flickering between the rows, like the search never ended. I know they are not real, but I still slow down and watch them until they fade. I have not been back since. The field was sold to a developer last spring, and they say new houses will be built where the maze once stood. People like to believe that time heals, but in our town it only buried what we could not face. Every autumn when the air smells like wet hay and smoke, I think of Tyler, his blue hoodie, the pendant in the ditch, the silence that followed. None of us talk about it anymore, but every one of us remembers the night the search began, and the morning we wished we had never found what we were looking for. It happened during my senior year, after one of our late fall soccer practices. The days were already short, and by the time the bus left the school parking lot, the sky had that bruised purple color that means the sun is almost gone. There were 12 of us, plus our driver, Mr. Daly, a quiet man who always had an old thermos of coffee that smelled like burnt toast. Everyone was tired, still in our uniforms, our shoes muddy, music playing low from someone's speaker near the back. It felt like any other ride home, except for the route, a detour through a narrow road that cut between cornfields because of roadwork near town. About 20 minutes in, the engine made this coughing sound and the whole bus shuddered like it had hiccups. Mr. Daly tried to restart it, but after a few attempts it just went silent. The air inside turned heavy, no hum of the motor, only the whisper of wind against the windows and the tall corn brushing along the sides. He told us to stay put while he went to look for help, said there was a farmhouse not far down the road. He grabbed his jacket, stepped out, and the door's pneumatic hiss was the last clear sound before everything felt strangely hollow. We waited, maybe 10 minutes at first, then 20. The light outside kept fading until all we could see through the glass was the dull reflection of ourselves and a thin stripe of orange horizon. Someone cracked a joke about ghosts in the corn to break the tension, but it didn't land. One of the younger students, Ellie, started recording on her phone, trying to capture how creepy the field looked. Just rows of stalks waving in the wind. The video's still online, I think, but the last part is what got people talking. Because after the laughter faded, there were footsteps, not Mr. Daly's, slower, uneven, circling the bus. At first we thought maybe it was him, or someone from the farmhouse he mentioned, but when Ellie called out, there was no reply. Just that rhythm of steps shifting through the dirt, stopping, then starting again from a different side. The kind of sound that doesn't match any pattern you recognize. Someone tried to use their phone flashlight to look outside, but the glare bounced off the glass, and it only made things worse, like we were trapped in our own reflection. That was when we heard the first tap on the side panel, light but deliberate near the emergency exit window. The tapping came again, this time closer to where we sat. It was faint, like the tip of a coin against metal, but steady enough that no one spoke over it. Someone whispered that maybe the wind was moving the stalks, but there was no wind strong enough to make that sound. Then came a scrape, long, dragging, along the length of the bus. It traveled slowly, almost as if whoever or whatever was outside was testing each panel. A few of us stood up and tried to look through the windows on that side, but it was useless. The corn was too dense, and everything beyond the glass looked like shifting shadows. Ellie stopped recording when the sound reached the back door. Her phone light flickered once, and I remember her face going pale in that dim glow. Mr. Daly had been gone nearly 40 minutes by then. We tried to convince ourselves that he was just lost, that maybe he had gone the wrong way down the road. One of the older boys, Ethan, said we should go find him, but nobody wanted to step outside first. It was strange. None of us said we were scared, but nobody moved either. The silence between us said everything. At some point, a pair of headlights appeared far down the road, faint but real. Everyone rushed to the front thinking help had come, but the lights never got closer. They just hovered there, distant and still, like whoever was driving had stopped in the middle of the road. When they finally blinked out, it felt like the night got heavier. The air turned colder inside the bus, though none of the windows were open. I could smell something faint then, wet dirt and something like rust. That was when the footsteps returned, faster this time, circling again. But there were more of them, too many. It sounded like a crowd walking through the field just out of sight, moving in patterns that made no sense. The rhythm of it built until the sound was coming from both sides, and a low voice, maybe 2 or 3 of them, started whispering our names. Not all of us, just a few. Mine was one of them. No one said anything after that. We just sat there, waiting until someone at the back said they saw a light inside the corn rows. The light was small, maybe the size of a lantern, weaving between the stalks as if someone was carrying it low. We all crowded toward the windows, but the glass fogged with our breath. I remember wiping it clear with my sleeve and seeing the light stop halfway to the bus. Then another one appeared behind it, and another, 3 in total, flickering like weak flashlights. For a moment we were sure it was Mr. Daly bringing help, and the relief hit all at once, until one of the lights started moving upward, high above the corn, like it was floating. The other 2 stayed still. The laughter we expected never came. No voices. Just that steady shuffle of footsteps drawing closer again. Someone yelled that we needed to get out. Panic spread quick. Ethan pulled the emergency lever, and cold air rushed in with the smell of soil and something metallic. We climbed down one by one, our sneakers sinking into the soft dirt. The field surrounded us on every side, the corn towering higher than our heads. The bus lights flickered once behind us, then went dark. Nobody said a word after that. It was as if sound itself didn't want to exist out there. The only thing we could hear was breathing, ours, and something else pacing in rhythm just beyond the rows. When the police found me, it was already morning. I was sitting in the middle of the road, wrapped in one of those silver rescue blankets, staring at the spot where the bus had been. They said they found it a mile away, engine still cold, door open, no one inside. Every other student was gone. The only thing left was Ellie's phone wedged under one of the seats. They played part of the last recording for me later. Those footsteps, the low whisper, and then what sounded like wind passing through the microphone before it cuts off completely. I wish I could tell you more, but I do not remember anything after running into the corn. To this day, no one has found the others, not even a piece of clothing or a footprint beyond the road. The official report says the bus rolled down a slope and got stuck, that the kids must have wandered off in confusion. But I still hear it sometimes when I drive past empty fields at dusk, the same rhythm of steps brushing through dry stalks, circling, waiting. The sound follows the car for a while, then fades when the light is gone. That night feels like it never ended, like part of me is still sitting on that bus, watching those 3 lights sway in the dark. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Widowhood changes you in ways you never expect, and one of those changes was my decision to stay on the property Glenn and I had built together in rural Montana. He passed 2 winters before that night, and somewhere between burying him and turning 43, I convinced myself that staying made sense. Our nearest neighbors, the Farley family, lived about 3 miles down the county road, and the closest sheriff's substation was in Ridgefield, a good 50-minute drive on roads that turned treacherous after dark. People in the city think isolation sounds peaceful, romantic even. But there is nothing romantic about being a woman alone in a house surrounded by wheat fields and darkness that stretches in every direction. That particular night in early November 2017, I had gone to bed around 10, exhausted from splitting firewood and fixing a section of fence the wind had knocked down. My 2 dogs, a German shepherd named Duke and a mutt named Copper, slept in their usual spots by the wood stove. The wind had died down and the house had settled into that deep, consuming quiet that only exists miles away from civilization. I woke to Duke's growl, low and guttural, the kind of sound he only made when something was genuinely wrong. My eyes opened to complete darkness, and for a moment I lay still, listening, trying to separate real sounds from the remnants of whatever dream I had been having. Then Copper joined in, both dogs now at the bedroom window, their bodies rigid, hackles raised in silhouettes against the faint moonlight coming through the curtains. I heard it then, distant but unmistakable, other dogs barking somewhere out in the night. The Farleys had hounds, and they never barked like that unless something had them spooked. I pushed myself up on one elbow, reaching for the lamp on my nightstand, when I saw it, a sweep of headlights moving slowly across my eastern field. Not on the road, but actually in the field, cutting through the harvested wheat stubble. My heart began pounding as I watched the lights move with purpose, methodical, like whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Nobody had any business being on my property at. I checked the clock, 2:47 in the morning. I did not turn on the lamp. Some instinct, ancient and primal, told me to stay in the dark. Instead, I slid out of bed and crouched below the window, peering over the sill just enough to watch. The headlights had stopped moving now, parked at the edge of my property near the old grain silo Glenn had never gotten around to tearing down. Then they went dark. For a long moment, nothing happened, just the dogs growling and the distant sound of the Farley hounds still going wild. Then I saw a second set of headlights appear, coming from the opposite direction, from the west where the old logging road cut through the tree line. These lights also moved slowly, deliberately, and they also stopped at the perimeter of my property before going dark. My mouth went dry. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers finding it in the darkness, and I pressed the power button. The screen lit up and I immediately dimmed it, shielding the glow with my body. No signal. There was never good signal out here, but sometimes I could get one bar near the kitchen window. I moved through the house without turning on any lights, Duke and Copper following close behind me. their nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. When I reached the kitchen, I pressed myself against the wall beside the window that faced the front yard and the long gravel driveway that connected my property to the county road. What I saw made my legs go weak. A third vehicle was parked at the end of my driveway, its headlights also off, just a dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. They had surrounded the house. 3 vehicles, positioned at 3 different points, and all of them had known exactly where to stop, exactly how to approach without being seen from the road. I checked my phone again, holding it up near the window, watching desperately for even one bar to appear. Nothing. I thought about the landline in the living room, the old rotary phone Glenn had insisted on keeping because cell service was so unreliable. I started moving toward it, staying low, when I heard something that stopped me cold, the distinct sound of a radio crackling somewhere outside, followed by a man's voice too quiet to make out the words, but close enough to hear the tone. I crawled to the living room, my knees scraping against the rug Glenn's mother had given us as a wedding gift. The rotary phone sat on the small table by the couch, and I lifted the receiver as quietly as I could, pressing it to my ear. Dead silence. No dial tone. Nothing. They had cut the line. These were not drunk teenagers or lost hunters. These were people who had planned this, who knew that cutting the phone line would leave me stranded, who understood that by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would be far too late. I set the receiver down and pressed my back against the couch, trying to think. Glenn's shotgun was in the bedroom closet, a 12-gauge Remington he had taught me to use for coyotes that sometimes went after the chickens. I had not fired it since he died, but I knew it was loaded, knew there was a box of shells on the top shelf beside it. I needed to get back to the bedroom without being seen through any of the windows. Duke suddenly let out a sharp bark, and I grabbed his collar, pulling him close, whispering for him to be quiet. Through the living room window, I saw a beam of light sweep across the front porch. A flashlight. Someone was on my porch, right outside the front door, maybe 15 feet from where I was crouched in the darkness. I heard footsteps on the wooden boards, slow and deliberate, and then the light paused at the window. I pressed myself flat against the floor, my cheek against the cold hardwood, holding both dogs by their collars as they trembled and growled. The beam moved across the room above me, illuminating the couch, the bookshelf, the fireplace mantel with our wedding photo still displayed. Then the light clicked off, and I heard the footsteps retreat, followed by that radio crackle again. A different voice this time, deeper, responded with something I could not understand. They were communicating positions, coordinating movements, and they were doing it with the kind of calm efficiency that terrified me more than anything else. I waited until the footsteps faded before I started crawling toward the hallway that led back to the bedroom. Every creak of the floorboard sounded impossibly loud, and I kept expecting a window to shatter or a door to burst open at any moment. When I finally reached the bedroom, I eased the closet door open and felt around in the darkness until my fingers closed around the cold steel of the shotgun barrel. I pulled it out, checked that it was loaded by touch alone, and grabbed the box of shells from the top shelf. My hands were unsteady as I shoved extra shells into the pockets of my pajama pants. I had no plan beyond this, no idea what I was supposed to do against multiple armed men who clearly knew what they were doing. I thought about hiding, about crawling into the space beneath the bed or locking myself in the bathroom, but I knew that would only delay whatever was coming. These people had not gone through all this trouble just to leave empty-handed. They wanted something, and the only thing of value in this house was me. A sound from the back of the house made Duke lunge forward, barking furiously, and this time I could not stop him. He bolted down the hallway toward the kitchen, Copper right behind him, and I heard the back door rattle violently in its frame. Someone was trying to force it open. I ran after the dogs, the shotgun raised, my bare feet slapping against the floor. When I reached the kitchen, I saw the door shaking as someone threw their weight against it from outside. The deadbolt was holding, but the door was old, the wood frame soft from decades of Montana winters. It would not hold for long. I aimed the shotgun at the center of the door and screamed at the top of my lungs that I had a gun, that I would shoot anyone who came through. The pounding stopped. For a moment there was silence, and I heard that radio crackle again, followed by a voice I will never forget as long as I live. It was calm, almost amused, and it said clearly enough for me to hear through the door. "She is in the kitchen, armed, 12 gauge, probably the husband's old Remington." They knew about Glenn. They knew about the gun. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I almost doubled over. These were not strangers who had randomly chosen my house. These were people who had watched me, studied me, learned my routines and my vulnerabilities. I thought about all the times I had gone into town for groceries, all the conversations I had at the feed store or the gas station, mentioning that I lived alone now, that Glenn was gone, that the property was too big for one person, but I could not bring myself to sell. I had told strangers my entire situation without ever thinking twice. The voice outside spoke again, this time directed at me. "Mrs. Hartley, we know you are alone. We know the nearest deputy is 47 minutes away on a good night, and the roads are icy. We know your cell phone does not work out here. We have done this before, and it always goes easier when people cooperate." The casual way he listed these facts, like he was reading from a checklist, made me realize how carefully they had planned everything. They had probably watched the house for weeks, maybe months, noting when I went to bed, when I woke up, which lights I turned on and when I turned them off. I backed away from the door, the shotgun still raised, my mind racing through options that all seemed hopeless. The windows were old single-pane glass, easy to break. The doors were solid, but the frames were weak. Even if I shot one of them, there were others, and they would be through the house before I could reload. Then I remembered something, the root cellar. Glenn had dug it himself the second year we lived here, an underground space beneath the kitchen accessible through a trap door hidden under the rug by the pantry. He had installed a heavy steel door at the bottom of the stairs, paranoid about tornadoes even though they were rare this far north. The cellar had supplies, canned food, water, a battery-powered radio, and most importantly, it had a lock that could only be opened from the inside. If I could get down there with the dogs, I could wait them out. Eventually, someone would notice I was missing. Eventually, help would come. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan I had, and I was running out of time. I moved quickly, pulling back the rug with one hand while keeping the shotgun ready with the other. The trapdoor was right where it had always been, the iron ring handle cold against my palm. I yanked it open and whistled for the dogs, and Duke understood immediately, bounding down the wooden stairs into the darkness below. Copper hesitated, confused, and I had to grab him by the collar and practically shove him through the opening. I was halfway down the stairs myself when I heard glass shatter somewhere in the house, followed by heavy footsteps and voices calling out to each other. They were inside. I pulled the trapdoor shut above me, fumbling in the darkness for the steel door at the bottom of the stairs. My fingers found the handle, and I pulled it closed just as I heard footsteps in the kitchen directly above me. The lock was a heavy deadbolt, the kind you would find on a commercial door, and it slid into place with a solid thunk that echoed in the small concrete room. I pressed my back against the cold wall, both dogs huddled against my legs, and I listened to the sounds of my home being torn apart above me, cabinets slamming, furniture being overturned, and then footsteps directly over the trapdoor, followed by the sound of someone pulling at the handle. A voice, the same calm voice from before, called down through the floor. "Mrs. Hartley, that is a very old door. We have tools, we have time. The choice is yours." I did not answer. I sat in the darkness with my shotgun aimed at the steel door. My dogs pressed against me, and I waited. I heard drilling, prying, the sound of metal scraping against metal. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Then, suddenly, it stopped. I heard voices arguing, urgent now, the calm tone gone. A vehicle engine started somewhere outside, then another. Through the concrete walls, I heard tires on gravel moving fast, moving away. I did not move from that cellar until sunlight began to creep through the small ventilation grate near the ceiling. When I finally climbed out, my house was destroyed. Every drawer emptied, every closet ransacked, furniture overturned and broken. But I was alive. The sheriff found me sitting on my front porch with the shotgun across my lap, and I told him everything. He listened with the expression I could not read, then told me there had been 3 other home invasions in the county over the past 2 years, all isolated properties, all women living alone. 2 of those women were never seen again. They never caught the men who did it. I sold the property 6 weeks later and moved to Bozeman, where I can see my neighbors' houses from my kitchen window. I still do not sleep through the night. I still wake up at 2:47 in the morning, listening for dogs barking in the distance, waiting for headlights to sweep across a field that no longer exists outside my window. Ridgefield, Montana is the kind of place that does not show up on most maps. Population 200 and something, depending on who had moved away or passed on that year. My best friend Haley and I were sent there every summer to stay with my grandparents while our parents worked. And by the time we finished 6th grade, we knew that dirt road to Perkins General Store better than we knew our own backyards. 4 miles of packed earth cutting through wheat fields and abandoned farmland, with nothing but fence posts and the occasional rusted tractor to break up the endless gold horizon. We had walked it dozens of times without incident, 2 12-year-old girls with too much energy and not enough supervision, picking wild blackberries and racing each other to the old Jennings barn that sat rotting at the halfway point. Our grandparents never worried about us making that trip alone, because nothing ever happened in Ridgefield. That was the whole point of the place, the safety of isolation, the comfort of knowing every single face in town. On that Thursday morning in early June, Grandma pressed a $20 bill into my palm and handed me her grocery list, and Haley and I set off like we had 100 times before. The heat hit us the moment we stepped off the porch, that dry Montana summer heat that makes the air shimmer above the road like a mirage. Haley complained about the dust getting into her sandals, and I told her she should have worn sneakers like I did, and we bickered about nothing as we walked. We were roughly 2 miles in when I heard the engine approaching from behind, which meant nothing at first because farmers drove that road constantly. But this vehicle slowed down in a way that made me turn around and look. A dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper and mud splattered across the wheel wells pulled up alongside us, keeping pace with our walking speed. The driver leaned across the passenger seat and rolled down the window, and I got my first clear look at his face. He had thin blonde hair slicked back against his scalp with something greasy, pale blue eyes that seemed too wide for his face, and a smile that stretched his lips in a way that showed every single one of his yellow teeth. When he spoke, his voice came out warm and friendly, the kind of voice adults use when they want children to trust them immediately. "You girls must be the Whitaker grandkids," he said, nodding like he already knew the answer. "Heading to Perkins, I bet. Your grandma send you for groceries?" I remember feeling a small wave of relief at that moment, because he knew our family name, which meant he had to be a local, someone safe. Haley relaxed a little beside me too, her shoulders dropping from their tense position. The man kept talking, explaining that he worked on one of the farms further out past the county line and came through Ridgefield every few weeks for supplies. He said his name was Gene, or maybe it was Dean, something short and plain that I cannot remember clearly anymore because everything that came after erased those small details from my mind. What I do remember is what he said next, leaning further toward the open window with that strange wide smile still plastered across his face. He told us there had been coyote attacks on the road up ahead, that a pack had gotten bold and gone after a couple of dogs just yesterday, and it was not safe for 2 young girls to be walking alone. Haley looked at me with uncertainty in her eyes, and I could tell she was trying to decide whether to believe him. The thing was, coyote problems were not unusual in that area, and we had been warned about them before by our grandfather, who kept a rifle by the back door for that exact reason. So the story made sense, and the man seemed to know that it would. He offered us a ride the rest of the way to the store, saying it would only take a few minutes, and he was heading that direction anyway. I hesitated, feeling something heavy settle in my chest that I could not explain, a reluctance that had no logical source. But Haley was already moving toward the truck, and I did not want to seem like a scared little kid in front of her. I climbed into the cab after her, settling onto the cracked leather bench seat that smelled like cigarettes and something else, something sour and faintly chemical that I could not identify. The man pulled back onto the road, and for a minute everything seemed normal. Just the rumble of the engine and the dust billowing behind us through the rear window. Then I noticed we were not going the right way. The road to Perkins continued straight for another 2 miles before curving slightly east toward the village center. But this man had turned left onto a narrow side path that led into the overgrown Jennings property. I knew that land well because Haley and I had explored the edges of it many times, daring each other to get closer to the collapsing barn with its dark windows that looked like empty eye sockets. The truck bounced over ruts and potholes as the main road disappeared behind a wall of tall wild grass, and my heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. I asked him where we were going, trying to keep my voice steady, and he said this was a shortcut that would get us to the store faster. But that was a lie, and I knew it was a lie, because this road led nowhere except deeper into abandoned farmland. Haley grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight, her palm slick with sweat. I looked at her face and saw my own fear reflected back at me, her eyes wide and her lips pressed together in a thin line. The man kept talking in that same cheerful tone, telling us about the weather and the wheat harvest and other things that meant nothing, filling the air with words so we would not have time to think. But I was thinking, and what I was thinking was that nobody knew where we were. Our grandparents expected us to be gone for at least 2 hours, and if we disappeared into these fields, no one would even start looking for us until lunchtime. The truck slowed down as we approached the old Jennings barn, and I saw that someone had been here recently because there were fresh tire tracks in the mud, and the padlock on the barn door had been replaced with a shiny new one. The man pulled the truck to a stop and turned off the engine, and in that sudden silence I could hear birds singing somewhere far away and the tick of the cooling motor. He turned to look at us with that same terrible smile, and he said we should wait here for just a minute while he checked on something inside the barn. That was when Haley screamed. It was not a word or a call for help, just a raw animal sound of pure terror that seemed to unlock something in both of us. She yanked the door handle and threw herself out of the truck before I even understood what was happening, and I followed her a half-second later, my feet hitting the ground hard enough to send a jolt of pain up through my ankles. The man shouted something behind us, his friendly voice gone sharp and ugly, but I did not turn around to see if he was chasing us. We ran into the tall grass, pushing through stalks that whipped against our faces and arms, our breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear Haley somewhere to my left, crashing through the vegetation, and I angled toward the sound of her footsteps. The grass was so high that I could not see more than a few feet in any direction, and I kept expecting to feel a hand close around my arm or my hair at any moment. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I did not slow down, could not slow down, because somewhere behind us was a man who had taken us to an abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere, and I knew with absolute certainty what that meant. We ran until the grass thinned out and gave way to a plowed field, the dirt soft and uneven beneath our feet. I stumbled twice and caught myself with my hands, scraping my palms raw against rocks and dry clods of earth. Haley was crying now, loud hiccuping sobs that she could not control, and I grabbed her wrist and pulled her along because we could not stop yet. In the distance, I could see a farmhouse with a red roof and a weather vane shaped like a rooster, and I pointed toward it and told Haley to keep going. My whole body was shaking, not just my hands but my legs and my jaw and something deep inside my chest that would not stop trembling no matter how hard I tried to control it. We crossed what felt like miles of open field, exposed and vulnerable under that bright blue sky, before we finally reached the farmhouse and I started pounding on the door with both fists. A woman in her 60s opened it, flour on her apron and confusion on her face, and I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and desperate, and I could see that she did not understand. Her name was Loretta Grimes, and she sat us down at her kitchen table and gave us glasses of water while she called our grandparents. Haley could not stop crying. her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. And I held her hand across the table while I tried to answer Loretta's questions. I told her about the man in the green truck, about the lie he told us about coyotes, about the turn onto the side road and the barn with the new padlock. Loretta's face went pale as I spoke, and she picked up the phone again to call the sheriff's office in the next town over. My grandfather arrived 20 minutes later, his face a mask of fear and fury that I had never seen before, and he wrapped both of us in his arms so tight I could barely breathe. The sheriff's deputy showed up an hour after that, a young man with a notepad who wrote down everything I said and nodded seriously but did not seem particularly alarmed. He told us the description matched several trucks in the county and that without a license plate number, there was not much they could do. My grandmother kept saying we should never have been walking alone, that it was her fault for sending us, and the guilt in her voice made me feel worse than anything else that had happened that day. The following weeks were strange and uncomfortable in ways I did not expect. Word spread through Ridgefield quickly, as it does in small towns, but the reaction was not what I thought it would be. Some people believed us completely and praised us for being smart enough to run. But others, including people I had known my whole life, suggested that we had misunderstood the situation. Maybe the man really was just trying to help, they said. Maybe we panicked for no reason and made a nice farmer look like a criminal. One older man at the general store told my grandfather that city kids were always too suspicious, too dramatic, and that we probably scared a good Samaritan half to death by jumping out of his truck like that. The doubt hurt almost as much as the memory of that day, and Haley and I stopped talking about what happened because it seemed like nobody wanted to hear it. We finished out the summer at our grandparents' house, but we never walked to the store alone again. And we never explored the old Jennings property, and we slept in the same bed every night because neither of us could stand to be alone in the dark. 6 weeks after that Thursday morning, my mother called with news that made her voice crack and tremble through the phone line. A man had been arrested in Carroll County, about 80 miles south of Ridgefield, after attempting to force a 9-year-old boy into his vehicle outside a gas station. The boy's father had been inside paying and came out just in time to see what was happening, and he held the man down until police arrived. The vehicle was a dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper. When investigators searched the property where the man lived, a rented trailer on the edge of an old farming community, they found things that my mother would not describe to me no matter how many times I asked. She only said that the man had done this before, in other counties, in other states, and that some of those children had never been found. I sat on the edge of my bed in my childhood room, the phone pressed against my ear, and I thought about that barn with the shiny new padlock and the fresh tire tracks in the mud. I thought about how close we had come to being part of a story that ended very differently. A story that might have ended with our photographs on missing person flyers stapled to telephone poles across Montana. Haley and I are adults now, both of us with families of our own, and we have only talked about that day a handful of times in all the years since. But I think about it more often than I would like to admit, usually when I see my own daughter walking home from school or riding her bike around the neighborhood. I taught her early about strangers and cars, and the lies that dangerous people tell, and I made sure she understood that politeness is never more important than survival. She knows that if something feels wrong, she should run first and explain later, and she knows that I will always believe her no matter what anyone else says. The man who drove that green truck is serving multiple life sentences now, locked away in a place where he cannot hurt anyone else. But sometimes late at night when sleep will not come, I still see his face through that rolled-down window. I still see those yellow teeth stretched into that wide, unnatural smile. And I still hear his friendly voice, asking if we were the Whitaker grandkids heading to the store. And I wonder how many other children heard that same voice, saw that same smile, and were not lucky enough or fast enough to escape into the tall grass before it was too late. My cousin got me the job at the grain facility out near Harlow County, about 40 minutes from the nearest town with a stoplight. He worked for the agricultural company that owned the place and said they needed someone to cover night shifts for a few weeks, while their regular guy recovered from back surgery. Simple work, he promised. Walk the perimeter twice a night, log any delivery trucks that came through, check the temperature gauges on the storage bays, and make sure nobody was messing around on the property. The pay was decent for what amounted to sitting in a small office trailer and reading most of the night. I had just finished my teaching certification and was waiting for the school district to finalize my contract for the fall semester, so the timing worked out. My girlfriend thought I was crazy for taking a job in the middle of nowhere, but we needed the money, and 6 weeks of overnight shifts seemed like easy cash. The facility itself sat on about 15 acres of flat land surrounded by cornfields on 3 sides and a county road on the 4th. There were 6 massive grain silos, a long metal warehouse for equipment storage, and 3 smaller storage bays used for overflow during harvest season. The office trailer where I spent most of my time was positioned near the front gate, close enough to the road that I could see headlights coming from a mile away. My first 3 shifts were exactly what my cousin described. Boring in the best way possible. I did my rounds at midnight and again at 4 in the morning, wrote down a whole lot of nothing in the logbook, and spent the rest of my time grading practice tests I had created for the class I would be teaching in September. The only company I had was the security cameras, 8 of them total, feeding grainy black and white footage to a monitor that looked like it belonged in the 90s. The night sounds out there took some getting used to. The grain settling in the silos made these deep groaning noises, and the wind coming across the fields would rattle the metal siding on the warehouse something fierce. It was my 4th shift when I noticed the first thing that seemed wrong. During my midnight round, I walked past Storage Bay 2, one of the smaller units used for equipment and spare parts, and saw fresh tire tracks in the gravel leading up to the roll-up door. Now that door was supposed to stay locked, and according to the schedule my cousin had given me, no deliveries were expected until the following Tuesday. I checked the lock and it was secure, so I figured maybe someone from the day crew had pulled up there earlier and I just had not noticed the tracks before. I wrote it down in the logbook anyway, the way I was supposed to, and finished my round without thinking much more about it. But when I came back around at 4 in the morning, I noticed something else. There was a dark stain on the concrete pad right outside the bay door, maybe 2 feet wide, like someone had spilled something and tried to wash it away. The edges were still wet. I crouched down and touched it, and my fingers came up with this faint pinkish color. Looked diluted, like whatever it was had been hosed down but not completely cleaned. I stood there for a while, trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. Maybe one of the day workers had cut himself and cleaned it up. Maybe someone hit a deer on the road and pulled in to check their vehicle. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, but something kept nagging at me. Why would anyone wash down a spill at a grain facility in the middle of the night? I took a few pictures with my phone, just in case, and went back to the trailer. I thought about calling my cousin, but it was almost 5 in the morning and I did not want to wake him up over what was probably nothing. The rest of that shift, I kept looking at those pictures, zooming in like I was going to find some answer hidden in the pixels. When the day supervisor showed up at 6 to relieve me, I mentioned the tire tracks and the stain. He was this older guy named Dwight, been working there for 15 years, and he just shrugged and said it was probably hydraulic fluid from one of the tractors. He did not seem concerned at all, so I let it go, but I saved those pictures anyway. 2 nights later, I found the tools. I was doing my 4 in the morning round, walking along the back side of the warehouse where the security cameras did not reach. There was a dead zone back there, maybe 60 feet of space between the building and the fence line that nobody had bothered to cover. I almost tripped over a canvas bag sitting in the weeds near the drainage ditch. It was heavy, and when I opened it, I found a set of bolt cutters, a crowbar, a roll of duct tape, and a box of latex gloves. None of it belonged to the facility. I knew every piece of equipment in that warehouse because I had walked through it during my orientation, and this stuff was not on any inventory list. The bolt cutters still had price tags on them from a hardware store I did not recognize. I stood there holding that bag, my heart going a mile a minute, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some random stuff that blew in or got dumped by kids messing around. But bolt cutters and duct tape do not just appear together by accident. I put everything back exactly how I found it, marked the spot in my head, and walked back to the trailer as fast as I could without running. I called my cousin that morning after my shift ended. Told him everything, the tire tracks, the stain, the bag of tools. He got quiet for a long time, which was not like him at all. Finally, he said I should keep my head down and not mention any of this to Dwight or anyone else at the facility. He said he would make some calls and figure out what was going on, but in the meantime, I should just do my job and stay in the trailer as much as possible. That advice did not sit right with me. I asked him what he thought was happening, and he just said some of the storage bays got leased out to third parties, and he did not always know what they were being used for. The way he said it made me feel like he knew more than he was telling me. I barely slept that day. I lay in bed at my apartment staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario. Drug storage maybe, stolen merchandise. I even thought about human trafficking, but that seemed too extreme, too much like something from a documentary. By the time I drove back out to the facility that evening for my next shift, I had almost talked myself into quitting. But I needed that money, and I kept telling myself I was probably overreacting to a bunch of coincidences. That night changed everything. I got to the facility around 9, same as always, and Dwight handed off the keys without much conversation. He seemed tired, distracted, and he left quicker than usual. I settled into the trailer, made some coffee, and started going through my lesson plans. Around 11, I noticed headlights on the security monitor. A truck coming down the access road from the back of the property, not from the main county road where deliveries usually came. That road was supposed to be gated and locked, only used during harvest season when they needed extra access for the big equipment. I watched the truck pull around behind Storage Bay 2, the same bay where I had found the tire tracks. It sat there for about 10 minutes with its lights off, and then it left the same way it came. No one got out that I could see. No one approached the trailer or checked in with me. According to every protocol I had been given, any vehicle on the property at night was supposed to log in with the night watchman. That was literally my entire job. I wrote down the time and a description of the truck, white full-size pickup, no visible plates from the camera angle, and I sat there wondering if I should go check the bay or just pretend I had not seen anything. I waited about an hour before I worked up the nerve to walk out there. The night was warm and still, no wind for once, and the silence felt heavier than usual. I took my flashlight and walked the long way around, staying close to the silos where I could duck out of sight if I needed to. When I got to Storage Bay 2, I noticed the padlock was different. The old one had been brass, weathered and scratched up from years of use. This one was silver, brand new, with a black rubber coating around the shackle. Someone had changed the lock. I put my ear against the roll-up door. I know that sounds stupid, like something from a movie, but I did not know what else to do. And I heard nothing at first, just the metal ticking as it cooled down from the day's heat. Then I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. Voices, muffled, impossible to make out the words, but definitely human voices coming from inside the bay. And then a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. A short, sharp cry, cut off almost immediately like someone had been hurt, and then silenced. I backed away from that door so fast I almost fell over my own feet. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just heard, trying to convince myself it was something else. An animal, a radio, anything but what it sounded like. I made it back to the trailer in what felt like seconds, locked the door behind me, and sat there staring at the security monitors with my phone in my hand. I should have called the police right then. I know that now. But I kept thinking about what my cousin had said, about keeping my head down, about how some of the bays were leased to third parties. What if I was wrong? What if I called the cops and it turned out to be nothing? And I lost my job and my cousin lost his job, and I looked like a paranoid idiot. I sat there for 20 minutes, maybe longer, arguing with myself. And then I saw movement on the monitor. Someone was walking toward the trailer. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes, coming from the direction of Storage Bay 2. He was not rushing, not trying to hide. He walked like someone who belonged there, like someone who had every right to be on that property in the middle of the night. I watched him get closer and closer until he walked right out of the camera's frame, and then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside the trailer door. He knocked 3 times, slow and deliberate. I did not answer. I did not move. I barely breathed. Through the small window next to the door, I could see the outline of his shape, just standing there, waiting. Then he spoke, and his voice was calm, almost friendly. He said he knew I was in there and that we needed to have a conversation about what I had seen over the past few nights. He said it in a way that made it clear he already knew everything. The pictures I took, the bag of tools I found, the fact that I had been asking questions. He said I seemed like a smart guy, and smart guys understood when it was better to look the other way. He said some people made good money just by not seeing things, and that could be me if I wanted it to be. He never raised his voice, never made an explicit threat. He did not have to. The implication was clear enough. I sat there in the dark, my phone still in my hand, and I did not say a single word. After what felt like forever, he knocked once more, just once, and then the footsteps moved away. I watched on the monitor as he walked back toward the storage bay, got into a dark SUV I had not noticed before, and drove off using that back access road. I did not finish that shift. The second his taillights disappeared from the camera, I grabbed my keys and walked straight to my car. I did not clock out, did not leave a note, did not call anyone. I just drove. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and I kept checking the rearview mirror the entire 40 minutes back to town. I called my cousin the next morning and told him I was done, that I was not going back to that facility ever again. He did not argue. He did not ask questions, he just said he understood, and that he would take care of it with the company. A week later, I saw on the local news that there had been a fire at an agricultural storage facility in Harlow County. Electrical malfunction, they said. Storage Bay 2 was completely destroyed. No injuries reported, no investigation opened. The facility shut down for repairs and never reopened. My cousin stopped returning my calls after that. We have not spoken in almost 2 years now, and when I see him at family gatherings, he acts like nothing ever happened. Like those 6 weeks just got erased from both our memories. I never found out what was really going on in that storage bay. I never found out who that man was or what happened to whoever made that sound I heard through the door. Some nights I still think about it. Lying awake at 3 in the morning, running through everything I should have done differently. I should have called the police that first night when I found the stain. I should have trusted my gut instead of listening to my cousin. I should have done something instead of just running away, but I did not, and now I have to live with that. The teaching job came through a few weeks after everything happened, and I threw myself into work, tried to move on, tried to convince myself that whatever was happening at that facility was not my problem anymore. But every now and then, I will be driving at night and I will pass some industrial building sitting alone in the dark, lights off, nothing moving, and I will feel this cold twist in my chest. Because I know now that there are places like that everywhere. Places where things happen that nobody talks about, and there are people whose job it is to make sure nobody ever finds out. I was almost one of those people. Sometimes I wonder if the only reason I am still here, still able to tell this story, is because I was smart enough to stay quiet and scared enough to run. And I do not know which part of that bothers me more. Rural Kansas has a way of making you feel both free and completely exposed at the same time. When my dad passed in 2017, he left me 47 acres of farmland that had been in our family since my great-grandfather bought it dirt cheap during the Depression. My wife Sheila and I had been renting a cramped apartment in Denver for 6 years by then, and with our twin daughters about to start kindergarten, the timing felt right. We moved in that September, right around my high school reunion, which made me realize how much time had slipped by since I left that small town as a kid, dreaming of city life. The property sat at the end of a long dirt road, almost a mile from the county route, surrounded by nothing but wheat fields and a few scattered oak trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember. The previous tenant, a guy named Jerry Mullins who helped my dad maintain the place after his stroke, had moved out 3 months before we arrived. The house needed work, but it was ours, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I could breathe. The trouble started in late October, maybe 6 weeks after we settled in. We had been dealing with the usual rural annoyances: hunters cutting across the back acres without permission, teenagers using the empty barn for weekend parties, that kind of thing. Sheila found beer cans and cigarette butts near the old grain silo one morning, and that was the final straw for her. She wanted a gate, something solid with a good lock, to keep people from just driving onto our land whenever they felt like it. I agreed, mostly to ease her mind, and spent a whole Saturday installing a heavy steel gate at the entrance where our dirt road met the county route. I bought a thick padlock from the hardware store in town, one of those hardened steel ones that cost almost $40. We each kept a key, and I hid a spare inside the hollow fence post nearby, just in case. That first night with the gate locked, I remember Sheila squeezing my hand at dinner and saying she finally felt safe out here. I believed her when she said it, and I believed it myself. 3 days later, I woke up around 5 in the morning to let the dog out and noticed the gate was wide open. Not broken, not forced, just open, swinging gently in the November wind like someone had casually unlocked it and forgotten to close it behind them. I walked the whole length of that dirt road in my bathrobe and boots, flashlight in hand, looking for any sign of what happened. Nothing. No trash, no footprints that I could make out in the dark, no indication that anyone had even been there. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it properly, even though I could picture myself clicking that padlock shut and tugging it twice to make sure. Sheila gave me a look when I came back inside, the kind of look that said she was trusting me to keep us safe out here. I promised her it would not happen again, and I meant it. That evening I checked the lock 3 separate times before coming inside for dinner, but it did happen again. The following Monday morning, Sheila was the one who found it, gate wide open, padlock hanging loose on the chain like it had been gently placed there by someone with all the time in the world. This time I noticed something that made my chest tighten: fresh tire tracks in the dirt, deep grooves from a heavy vehicle that had driven right up our road sometime during the night. I followed those tracks almost halfway to the house before they curved off toward the old barn and disappeared into the harder ground near the equipment shed. I searched that barn top to bottom, checked every stall, climbed up into the hayloft where dust hung thick in the morning light. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed, but someone had definitely been on our property. Someone with a key. I called the sheriff that afternoon, and Deputy Nolan came out to take a report, but he seemed almost bored by the whole thing. "Probably just kids," he said. "Probably someone messing with you." I wanted to believe him, but those tire tracks told a different story. I replaced the lock that same week, drove 30 miles to a different hardware store because I did not want to buy from the same place, thinking maybe somehow someone had gotten a duplicate made. This new padlock was even heavier, a different brand with keys that had a unique pattern cut into them. I threw away the old lock entirely and made sure only Sheila and I had copies this time. No spare hidden in the fence post, nothing. For about 10 days, everything seemed normal. The gate stayed locked, the road stayed empty, and I started to convince myself that Deputy Nolan had been right after all. Maybe it really was just some kids playing a prank, and once they realized we were serious about security, they moved on to easier targets. Sheila stopped checking the windows every night before bed. The girls started playing outside again without one of us hovering nearby. I let my guard down, and that was exactly when things got worse. It was a Saturday morning in mid-November when I walked out to check the gate and found something that made me stop dead in the middle of the road. The gate was locked, completely secure, chain wrapped tight, padlock clicked shut just like I had left it. But it was not my padlock. The one hanging there was silver instead of black, a completely different brand, with a keyhole that my keys would never fit. Someone had come onto our property during the night, removed my lock entirely, and replaced it with their own. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This was not a prank. This was not teenagers looking for a place to drink beer. Whoever was doing this wanted me to know they could come and go whenever they pleased, that no lock I bought would keep them out. They were sending a message, and the message was clear. This property belonged to them as much as it belonged to me. I cut that lock off with bolt cutters and bought a third one that afternoon, but my hands were unsteady the whole drive home. Sheila wanted to move. She said it plainly over dinner that night, the girls already in bed, her voice low and controlled in a way that scared me more than yelling would have. She said she did not feel safe anymore, that whoever was doing this knew too much about our routines, about when we were asleep, about how to get in without leaving a trace. I tried to calm her down, told her we would figure it out. But the truth was I did not have answers. I called Deputy Nolan again the next morning, and he came out to look at the new lock I had cut off, turning it over in his hands like it was a curiosity rather than evidence. He said there was not much he could do without catching someone in the act. No crime had technically been committed, no theft, no property damage beyond the locks themselves. He suggested we install cameras, maybe motion lights, something to discourage whoever was doing this. It felt like being told to solve my own problem, but I did not know what else to do. That night I ordered 2 trail cameras online, the kind hunters use to photograph deer, and paid extra for overnight shipping. The cameras arrived on a Wednesday, and I spent most of that afternoon mounting them. One pointed directly at the gate, hidden inside a wooden birdhouse I nailed to a tree about 20 feet back, and another aimed at the dirt road from the corner of our front porch. They were motion-activated, designed to capture clear images even in total darkness using infrared. I tested them a dozen times, walking back and forth in front of each one until I was satisfied they were working perfectly. Sheila watched me from the kitchen window the whole time, and when I came inside, she hugged me longer than usual. We both knew that whatever those cameras captured might change everything. That night I barely slept, checking my phone every hour to see if the motion alerts had triggered. Nothing happened. The next night was the same, quiet, still. The gate locked tight every morning when I walked out to check. By Friday, I started to wonder if maybe the cameras themselves had scared whoever it was away. If just knowing they were being watched was enough to make them stop. I should have known better than to hope for something that simple. Saturday morning, I woke up to 3 motion alerts on my phone, all time-stamped between 2 and 3 in the morning. My mouth went dry before I even opened the app. The first image showed headlights approaching the gate from the county route, just 2 bright circles floating in the darkness. The second image was clearer. A pickup truck, dark-colored, maybe blue or green, parked right in front of the gate with its engine still running. I could see exhaust rising in the cold air, caught by the infrared flash. The third image is the one that made me sit down on the edge of the bed and stay there for a long time. A man stood at the gate, his back to the camera, wearing a heavy work jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He was not cutting the lock. He was not forcing anything. He had a key in his hand, and he was unlocking my gate the same way I did every single day, with the easy confidence of someone who had done it 100 times before. The camera caught him mid-motion, his arm extended, the lock already open in his other hand. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged there. I showed Sheila the photos and watched her face go pale. She asked me if I recognized the truck, and I told her I did not. But something about it nagged at me. The shape of it, the way the tailgate sat slightly crooked like it had been bent in an accident years ago. I spent the next hour going through every image the cameras had captured, frame by frame, looking for anything that might help identify this person. The camera near the house had triggered too, showing the same truck driving slowly up our road, headlights off now, moving like a shadow through the darkness toward the barn. There were 6 images total of the vehicle parked behind the equipment shed, sitting there for almost 40 minutes before it turned around and left the same way it came. 40 minutes. This person had been on our property for 40 minutes while my wife and daughters slept in their beds, while I lay dreaming not 200 yards away. I called Deputy Nolan again, and this time he actually sounded interested. He asked me to email him the photos, said he would run the truck through some databases, see if anything came up. But I was done waiting for the sheriff to solve this. I needed to find out who this was myself. The next morning I drove into town and stopped at the diner where most of the old-timers gathered for breakfast. I figured if anyone knew about a dark pickup truck with a crooked tailgate, it would be someone who had lived in this county their whole life. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee, then started asking questions as casually as I could. Mentioned I was looking for someone who might do some work on my property, someone who knew the area well. A woman named Betty who worked the register overheard me and asked which property I was talking about. When I told her, she got quiet for a second before saying I should talk to Jerry Mullins. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. Jerry Mullins, the same man who had worked for my father, who had lived on our property as a caretaker for almost 3 years before we moved in. Betty said Jerry had a dark green Ford pickup, older model, with a dented tailgate from when he backed into a fence post years ago. She said he still lived about 15 miles north, in a trailer near the creek, and that he had been having money troubles ever since my father let him go. I did not correct her. My father never let Jerry go. Jerry had simply stopped showing up after my dad got too sick to manage the property anymore. I thanked Betty, left a $10 bill on the counter, and drove straight to the address she gave me. I found Jerry Mullins sitting on a plastic chair outside his trailer, smoking a cigarette and watching the road like he had been expecting someone. The truck was parked right there beside him. Dark green, crooked tailgate, the same vehicle from my camera footage. He did not seem surprised to see me. He did not even stand up when I got out of my car and walked toward him. I asked him straight out if he had been coming onto my property at night, and he just took a long drag of his cigarette before nodding slowly, like I had asked him about the weather. He said he still had keys. He said my father had given him copies years ago, back when he was trusted to come and go as he pleased, and he had never seen a reason to give them back. When I asked him why, what he was doing out there in the middle of the night, he looked at me with something that might have been shame or might have been defiance. I still cannot tell which. He said he had been storing things in the barn. Equipment, tools, some furniture he could not fit in his trailer. He said he figured no one was using the space anyway, and he did not think it would matter. 3 years of my father being sick, then dead, and Jerry had just kept coming and going like the property was still his responsibility. Like nothing had changed at all. I wanted to be angry. Part of me wanted to grab him by his jacket and demand to know what gave him the right. What made him think he could terrorize my family like that? Make my wife afraid to sleep in her own home. But looking at him sitting there in that plastic chair, his clothes worn thin, his trailer rusting at the edges, I mostly just felt tired. I told him to give me the keys, all of them, every copy he had ever made. He went inside without a word and came back with a small metal ring holding 4 different keys, each one labeled with faded tape that had my father's handwriting on it. Front gate, barn door, equipment shed, back entrance. He handed them over and I stood there holding them, feeling the weight of all those years my father had trusted this man. I asked Jerry if he understood that he could not come back, that this was over now. He nodded and stubbed out his cigarette on the arm of his chair. He said he was sorry, that he never meant to scare anyone, that he always came late at night specifically so he would not bother us. Like that made it better. Like the intent behind the fear somehow erased the fear itself. I drove home and told Sheila everything. We searched the barn together that afternoon and found exactly what Jerry had described. Boxes of old tools, a broken generator, some water-damaged furniture stacked in the corner of the hayloft. Nothing sinister, nothing dangerous, just the sad remnants of a man who could not let go of a place that was no longer his. I changed every lock on the property that weekend, installed new deadbolts, and added 2 more cameras just to be safe. Deputy Nolan closed the case without filing charges after I told him I did not want to press the issue. Jerry was pathetic more than criminal, and dragging him through the courts would not undo the weeks of fear we had already lived through. Sheila still checks the gate every morning before I wake up. Sometimes I catch her standing at the window late at night, watching the road, waiting for headlights that I pray will never come again. We talk about selling the place sometimes, starting over somewhere else, but this land belonged to my family for almost a century, and I'm not ready to let one troubled man take that from us. The locks are changed, the cameras are watching, and Jerry Mullins has not come back. But I still keep those 4 keys he gave me, tucked in a drawer beside my bed, where I can look at them whenever I need to remind myself that the thing I feared most was not a monster or a ghost. It was just a man with a key and nowhere else to go. Buying a house on 12 acres outside Charlottesville, Virginia was supposed to be the best decision of my life. I had spent my 20s bouncing between cramped apartments in Richmond, sharing walls with people who screamed at each other at all hours, and when my grandmother passed and left me enough for a down payment, I did not hesitate. The farmhouse was old, built in the 1940s according to the county records, with a sagging porch, outdated kitchen cabinets, and a well pump that groaned every morning like it was in pain. But it sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by woods on 3 sides, and for the first time in my adult life, I could not hear a single neighbor. I worked from home as a medical transcriptionist, typing up doctor notes in my pajamas, so the isolation suited me perfectly. My closest neighbor was Harold Jennings, an 80-something widower who lived about a mile down the road. We had a deal where I checked on him twice a week and he kept an eye on my property when I was away. By June, I had been living there for 8 months, and I finally felt like I belonged somewhere. That Saturday started like any other weekend. I woke up around 9, made coffee, and spent most of the day at my desk finishing a backlog of transcription files. For dinner, I made spaghetti and watched a couple episodes of a true crime show on Netflix. Ironic, considering what happened later. Around 11, I took my dog Pepper outside for her last bathroom break of the night. She was a 6-year-old shelter mutt, brown and white patches with one floppy ear that never quite stood upright. The air outside was thick and humid, typical for early June in Virginia, the kind of warmth that clings to your skin. I stood on the porch watching Pepper sniff around the yard, looking up at the stars scattered across the sky, in a way you never see in the city. Everything was quiet except for the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the woods. Pepper finished her business, trotted back inside, and I locked the front door behind us. Checked the back door out of habit. Went to bed around midnight feeling completely safe. I do not know how long I had been asleep when Pepper started growling. It was not her normal growl, the one she did when she saw a squirrel through the window or heard a car drive by on the main road. This was low and sustained, coming from deep in her chest, and she was standing at my bedroom door facing the hallway. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked the time, 1:47 a.m. For a few seconds, I just lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had set her off. Then I heard it. 3 knocks on the front door. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 steady knocks like someone was being polite about it. My first thought was that something had happened to Harold. Maybe he had fallen, maybe he had walked over in some kind of confused state. He was getting up there in age, and I worried about him. I got out of bed and walked quietly to the living room, Pepper staying right at my heels, still growling that low rumble. The front door had a small window at the top, but it was dark outside and I could not see much. I also had a window to the left of the door that looked out onto the porch, covered by thin curtains. I did not turn on any lights. Something told me not to, some instinct I cannot really explain. So I just stood there in the dark, trying to see through the curtain. Then came another knock, and a voice, a man's voice, calm and friendly. He said his car had broken down about half a mile up the road, and his phone was dead. He asked if he could use my phone to call someone for help. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like the kind of thing that could happen to anyone on these back roads where cell service was spotty at best. But it was almost 2 in the morning, and I was a woman alone, and something about the situation made every muscle in my body tighten. I moved closer to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch to get a better look at who was standing on my porch. He looked normal. That was the thing that made it so hard to know what to do. He was maybe 40, wearing jeans and a plain dark t-shirt, average build, short brown hair. He had his hands in his pockets and he was standing a few feet back from the door, not pressed up against it like someone desperate or aggressive would be. He looked like a regular guy who had car trouble. I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting all those crime documentaries get to my head. But Pepper was still growling, her hackles raised all the way down her spine, and that dog had never been wrong about people. I had seen her wag her tail at complete strangers, and I had seen her bark at men who later turned out to be bad news. She had instincts I had learned to trust. So instead of opening the door, I spoke through it. I told him I could call someone for him, asked what number he needed. He said he appreciated that, gave me a name, said his brother lived about 20 miles away and could come pick him up. He even gave me a phone number. It all sounded so normal, so reasonable. I had my phone in my hand, ready to dial, when I glanced out the side window again. The porch light was off, and the only illumination came from a half moon. But my eyes had adjusted to the darkness by then. The man was still standing there, patient, waiting. And that is when I saw movement near the tree line at the edge of my property, maybe 50 yards from the house. At first I thought it was a deer, we had plenty of those around. But the shape was wrong. It was upright. It was a person, moving slowly along the edge of the woods, heading toward the back of my house. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked back at the man on the porch, and he was still standing there with that same calm expression, like he had all the time in the world. He had no idea I had seen the other one. Or maybe he knew exactly what was happening and this whole thing was part of a plan. I stepped back from the window, trying not to make any sudden movements, trying to think. My mind was racing through options. I could call 911, but the nearest sheriff's station was at least 25 minutes away, and I had no idea how much time I had. I could call Harold, but what was an 80-year-old man going to do? I thought about the back door, wondered if it was really locked, wondered if that second person was already testing it. The man on the porch knocked again, a little louder this time, and asked if everything was okay. His voice was still friendly, but there was something underneath it now, a hint of impatience. I told him through the door that I was calling his brother right now, that help would be on the way soon. I was stalling, buying myself time to figure out what to do. I moved quickly and quietly through the dark house to the kitchen, where I could see the backyard through the window above the sink. The second figure was closer now, maybe 30 yards from the house, and I could see it was a man, bigger than the one on the porch, wearing dark clothes and some kind of cap. He was not even trying to hide anymore. He was just walking toward my back door like he belonged there. I grabbed the biggest knife from the block on the counter. It was not much, but it was something. Then I went back to the front of the house and told the man on the porch that I was not going to open the door. I said I had called 911 and the police were on their way. It was a lie. I had not called yet, but I needed him to believe it. There was a long pause. I could not see his face from where I was standing, but I could feel the shift in the air, like the whole situation had changed in that moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The friendliness was gone. He said something like, "Come on, I just need to use your phone. Why are you making this difficult?" But it was not a question. It was a statement. And then I heard the back door handle rattle. Not a knock, not a polite request. Someone was trying to open it, testing to see if it was locked. Pepper went absolutely crazy, barking and snarling and throwing herself toward the back of the house. The man on the porch started pounding on the front door now. Not knocking anymore, pounding, and he was saying something, but I could not hear it over Pepper and the blood rushing in my ears. I finally called 911. My fingers were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone twice. The dispatcher answered, and I started talking fast, too fast, trying to explain that two men were trying to break into my house, that I was alone, that I needed help right now. She asked for my address and I gave it to her, and she told me to stay on the line, that she was sending units my way. But I knew how far away they were. I knew I was on my own for at least 20 minutes, probably more. The pounding on the front door stopped suddenly, and that silence was almost worse than the noise. I stood in the hallway between the front and back of the house, knife in one hand, phone in the other. Pepper pressed against my leg, still growling. I could hear footsteps on the porch, then nothing. Then I heard glass break somewhere at the back of the house. Not the door, one of the windows. The one in the small laundry room that I always meant to put a better lock on but never did. Pepper bolted toward the sound, barking so loud it hurt my ears, and I heard a man curse, and then more glass breaking as he tried to clear the frame. I ran to the laundry room doorway and saw a dark shape halfway through the window, one leg already inside. I did not think. I just reacted. I screamed at him, something I do not even remember, and I swung that knife at his arm. I felt it connect, felt resistance, and he yelled and pulled back out the window so fast he cut himself more on the broken glass. There was blood on my kitchen knife and blood on the window frame, and I was shaking so hard I thought I might collapse. The dispatcher was still on the line asking what was happening, and I was trying to tell her, but the words were not coming out right. I backed away from the window, expecting him to come through again or expecting the other one to try the front, but for a moment, everything went quiet. Pepper was still barking, but it was different now, more frantic, like she was trying to track movement she could hear, but I could not. I kept switching my attention between the front door and the broken window, waiting for someone to come through, knowing I could not defend both at the same time. Then I heard a car engine start. It was faint at first, somewhere down my gravel driveway, and then it got louder and I heard tires spinning on loose rock. I ran to the front window and saw taillights disappearing down the road, moving fast with no headlights on. They were leaving. I did not understand it at first. I was still braced for someone to come crashing through a door or window. But the sounds outside faded, and then there was nothing but crickets and Pepper whimpering beside me. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher for another 18 minutes until I saw the red and blue lights coming up my driveway. 2 deputies came to the door and I finally unlocked it, still holding that knife, still shaking. One of them was a woman named Hartley, who took the knife gently from my hand and led me to sit down while her partner cleared the house. They found blood on the laundry room window, on the ground outside, and a trail of it leading into the woods where they must have parked their car somewhere out of sight. The deputies told me I did the right thing, that I was lucky, that most people would have opened that door. The sheriff's department investigated for weeks, but never found them. No matching DNA in the system, no witnesses, no abandoned car with a flat tire anywhere near my road. It was like they had never existed. But here is the part that still keeps me up at night, even 2 years later. About 3 weeks after it happened, a deputy called to tell me they had connected my case to 2 other incidents in the county from the previous year. Same pattern. A man knocking on a door late at night with a story about car trouble. A second person waiting in the shadows. The other 2 houses, the people had opened their doors. One woman was beaten badly and robbed. The other, an older couple, the husband did not survive. They had been targeting isolated homes, places where help was far away, places where people still trusted strangers enough to open their doors at night. I never found out if they were caught. I moved back to Richmond 6 months later. I still have Pepper, and she still growls sometimes at night for no reason I can see. When she does, I do not go back to sleep. I just sit there in the dark, listening, waiting for a knock that I hope never comes. "14 years of warehouse work in New Jersey had left me burned out in ways I did not fully understand, until I quit. When my buddy Glenn mentioned a seasonal crop management gig in rural Virginia, I jumped at it without thinking twice. My engagement had collapsed the previous spring. I was renting a depressing studio apartment, and the idea of wide-open spaces sounded like medicine. The contract was simple. 6 months overseeing soybean fields for an agricultural company, with a rent-free farmhouse included as part of the deal. I loaded my Ford pickup and drove 5 hours south on a Wednesday morning in early September 2018. The property sat at the end of a gravel road called Hendricks Mill Lane, about 12 miles from the nearest town with a grocery store. The farmhouse itself was nothing special, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like old wood, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. But the land stretched out flat and golden under the late summer sun, and for the first time in years I felt like I could actually breathe. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. The first week passed without any trouble. I spent my days learning the irrigation system, checking soil moisture levels, and driving the perimeter of the 300 acres I was responsible for. The nearest neighbor, according to my contract paperwork, was a property about half a mile east, but the county records listed it as unoccupied, owned by some agricultural trust based out of Richmond. I could see the outline of a farmhouse and a large barn from my kitchen window, sitting dark against the tree line. No cars in the driveway, no movement, no signs of life whatsoever. The isolation took some getting used to, especially at night when the silence became so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in bed. But I kept busy, called my mom every few days, and started settling into a routine that felt almost peaceful. It was on the 8th night, a Tuesday, when I first noticed the lights. I was brushing my teeth around 11 when I glanced out the bathroom window and saw a faint yellow glow coming from the supposedly empty property to the east. A single light, maybe in an upstairs window, burning steady through the darkness. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the trust had sent someone to check on the property, or perhaps a caretaker stopped by occasionally. I finished brushing my teeth and went to bed, but I kept thinking about that light. The next morning, I drove the perimeter as usual and slowed down when I passed the eastern boundary. From the road, the neighboring farmhouse looked exactly as abandoned as before, peeling white paint, overgrown grass pushing up through cracks in the driveway, a rusted mailbox leaning at a 45-degree angle. No vehicles anywhere. I parked my truck and walked closer to the fence line, trying to see if there were any fresh tire tracks or footprints. Nothing. The place looked like it had been empty for years. I even checked my phone to confirm what I remembered from the county records, and there it was in black and white. Property owned by Shenandoah Valley Agricultural Trust. Status unoccupied. Last recorded activity dated back to 2014. I drove back to my farmhouse feeling stupid for even worrying about it. Old houses have electrical quirks, timers on lights, all kinds of explanations. But then it happened again that same night. This time I was sitting on the back porch around 10, drinking a beer and listening to the crickets, when I saw not 1 but 3 lights come on in sequence across the neighboring property. First the upstairs window, then something on the ground floor, then a light inside the barn. They stayed on for maybe 20 minutes, then went dark one by one in reverse order. I sat there with my beer getting warm in my hand, watching that dark silhouette against the tree line, waiting for something else to happen. It did not. The property just sat there, black and silent, like it had been abandoned all along. I went inside and locked every door, which felt ridiculous given that I had not locked anything since arriving. That night I slept poorly, waking up twice to sounds I could not identify. A low rumble that might have been a vehicle on a distant road, a rhythmic creaking that was probably just the house settling. In the morning, I found myself checking the windows before I even made coffee, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The following Saturday, I drove into town to pick up supplies and decided to ask around about the neighboring property. The town was called Burkeville, a small cluster of buildings centered around a gas station, a hardware store, and a diner called Maxine's that seemed to serve as the local gathering spot. I grabbed a seat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs from a woman in her 60s with gray hair pinned up in a bun. Her name tag said Darlene. When she brought my food, I mentioned I was working the Henderson contract out on Hendricks Mill Lane, and she nodded like she already knew. Small towns are like that. I asked her about the property to the east of mine, the one owned by some agricultural trust, and her expression changed in a way I cannot quite describe. Not fear exactly, more like caution. She said she did not know much about it, that properties changed hands a lot around here, and then she moved down the counter to refill someone else's coffee. I tried asking the guy sitting 2 stools over, a heavy-set man in a John Deere cap, who had been eating pancakes in silence. He looked at me for a long moment, syrup still dripping from his fork, and said something I will never forget. Best not to get involved in other people's boundaries out here. I pressed him on what that meant, but he just shook his head and went back to his pancakes. The whole diner had gone quiet, and I became aware that several people were watching me with expressions that ranged from pity to something harder, something like warning. I finished my eggs without tasting them and left a bigger tip than usual, hoping that might loosen someone up. It did not. Outside, I ran into an older man loading bags of fertilizer into a pickup truck, and I tried one more time. I told him I was new to the area, just trying to understand the lay of the land, and asked if he knew anything about the property east of my place. He stopped loading and looked at me with pale blue eyes that had probably seen 70 winters or more. He said the land out there had history, that people who owned it tended to keep to themselves, and that I should do the same. When I asked what kind of history, he just climbed into his truck and drove away without another word. I stood there in the parking lot feeling like I had walked into the middle of a conversation that had been going on for decades, speaking a language everyone understood but me. That night, everything changed. I was lying in bed around 1 in the morning, not quite asleep but drifting in that halfway state, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. Slow, deliberate, crunching along at maybe 5 miles per hour. I got up and moved to the window without turning on any lights, keeping myself pressed against the wall so I could see out without being seen. A vehicle was rolling past my property on Hendricks Mill Lane. A large pickup truck or maybe an SUV, I could not tell for certain because it had no headlights on. Just a dark shape moving through the darker night, engine barely above idle. It passed my driveway and continued down the road toward the eastern property, then disappeared around a bend. I stood at that window for maybe 15 minutes waiting, until I saw it come back the other way. Same speed, same silence, same absence of lights. This time it slowed even more as it passed my house, and I swear I could feel eyes scanning my windows, even though I could not see anyone inside the vehicle. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After it passed, I did not go back to bed. I sat in the kitchen with every light off, watching the road through the window above the sink until the sun came up. The morning brought something worse. I walked the perimeter of my farmhouse the way I had started doing every day, checking for anything out of place, and that is when I found the footprints. They were in the soft dirt beneath my bedroom window, 2 distinct boot prints, deep enough to suggest someone had been standing there for a while. The window itself was about 5 feet off the ground, too high to see in without effort, but if someone stood on their toes or brought something to stand on, they would have had a clear view of my bed. I crouched down and studied those prints, trying to memorize every detail. Work boots size 11 or 12 with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. There were more prints leading away from the window, tracking through the grass toward the back of the property. I followed them for about 200 yards until they reached an old irrigation ditch that cut through the fields toward the eastern boundary. The ditch was dry and overgrown with weeds, clearly unused for years, but the vegetation had been trampled flat in a narrow path. Someone had been using this ditch as a corridor to access my property without being seen from the road. I called the sheriff's department that afternoon. A deputy named Womack came out around 4, a tall man with a sunburned neck and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had seen everything twice. I showed him the footprints, which had dried and hardened in the midday heat, and walked him out to the irrigation ditch. He listened to everything I said without interrupting, nodding occasionally, writing nothing down. When I finished, he stood there looking out toward the eastern property for a long moment before speaking. He said that folks out here valued their privacy, that property lines could be complicated when you had old irrigation rights and shared access roads from decades past. I told him someone had been watching me through my bedroom window, and he said he understood my concern, but that there was not much he could do without more evidence. No crime had technically been committed. Before he left, he gave me his card and told me to call if anything else happened, but the way he said it made me feel like he was just going through the motions. I watched his cruiser disappear down Hendricks Mill Lane and realized I was completely on my own out here. That night I pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom window and slept with a kitchen knife on the nightstand. The next 3 days were quiet, and I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. Maybe the footprints were from a surveyor or someone checking utility lines. Maybe the vehicle without headlights was just a local taking a shortcut who did not want to disturb anyone. I threw myself into work, spending long hours in the fields, trying to focus on soil samples and irrigation schedules instead of what might be lurking in the darkness. But on the 4th night, a Wednesday, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps on my porch. Not imagined, not dreamed, real footsteps, slow and deliberate, creaking across the old wooden boards. I lay perfectly still in bed, barely breathing, listening as they moved from one end of the porch to the other. Then they stopped right outside my front door. I heard the doorknob turn, just slightly, testing to see if it was locked. It was. The footsteps resumed, circling around the side of the house, pausing at each window. I tracked the sound as it moved, living room, kitchen, bathroom, until it reached the back door. Another doorknob test, another locked barrier. Then nothing. Silence so complete it roared in my ears. I did not move until sunlight started bleeding through the curtains, and when I finally got up to check, I found fresh boot prints circling the entire house. Same size, same wear pattern on the left heel. I decided I was done waiting for something worse to happen. That morning I drove to the hardware store in Burkeville and bought a trail camera, the kind hunters use to monitor deer paths. I mounted it on a tree facing the irrigation ditch, angled to capture anyone coming onto my property from that direction. Then I bought a second one and placed it on the corner of my porch, aimed at the front door and the gravel driveway. The clerk who sold them to me, a young guy named Sutton with a patchy beard and nervous hands, asked if I was having trouble with wildlife. I told him something like that. He looked at me for a beat too long before ringing me up, and I got the sense he knew exactly what kind of trouble I was having. That night, I sat in my truck at the edge of the property with the engine off and the windows down, watching the eastern tree line through binoculars I had ordered online 2 days before. Around midnight, I saw them. 2 figures emerging from the barn on the neighboring property, moving across the field in my direction. They walked in single file, staying low, using the terrain to mask their approach. I watched them enter the irrigation ditch about 300 yards out, and then I lost sight of them in the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I wanted to start the truck and flood them with headlights, but something told me that would only make things worse. Instead, I waited until I heard the soft crunch of footsteps near my house. Then I laid on the horn for a solid 30 seconds. The sound shattered the night like a bomb. When I finally stopped, I heard running, fast, panicked, retreating toward the ditch. The trail cameras caught everything. 2 men, faces partially obscured by baseball caps pulled low, crossing onto my property around 12:15 in the morning. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see they were carrying something, a duffel bag, maybe tools. I could not tell for certain. I saved the files to my phone and drove straight to the state police barracks 40 miles north, bypassing the local sheriff entirely. The trooper who reviewed the footage, a woman named Kendrick with close-cropped gray hair and no patience for small talk, made some calls while I waited in the lobby. An hour later, she told me what the locals had refused to say. The property to the east had been flagged in a federal investigation. Something about illegal cultivation hidden in the back acreage, distribution networks running through rural properties with absentee owners. The agricultural trust was a front, and the people operating out of there had been watching me since the day I arrived, trying to figure out if I was law enforcement or just an unlucky contractor who had wandered into the wrong place. Trooper Kendrick arranged for me to break my lease that same day. No penalties, no questions. I packed everything I owned in under 2 hours and drove north without looking back. I found out later that a raid happened about 3 weeks after I left. Multiple arrests, the whole operation dismantled. Sometimes I still think about those nights alone in that farmhouse, the footsteps circling in the darkness, the eyes watching from the tree line. The countryside had seemed so peaceful when I arrived, so empty and quiet. But the silence was never emptiness. It was just everyone around me holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. At the time, my life felt small and quiet in a way I actually needed. I'd rented a lonely countryside house tucked between fields and looping back roads that only tractors and grain trucks seemed to know by heart. I worked remotely, kept odd hours, and barely saw another person once the sun went down. The house itself was old but solid, with thick doors, narrow windows, and a long gravel driveway that disappeared into darkness at night. Most evenings were spent with a lamp on, the wind moving the trees and the distant hum of insects. I liked how cut off it felt, like the world had decided to leave me alone for a while. That sense of isolation was the whole reason I chose the place. It never occurred to me that someone else might notice how alone I was. The first thing that caught my attention happened late at night, when I was rinsing a mug at the sink and the room briefly brightened. Headlights slid across the far wall, slow and deliberate, not like a car passing through. I stepped closer to the window and watched the beams creep along the edge of the property, then disappear just beyond the trees. It didn't bother me much at first. Farm vehicles move strangely, and the roads around there twisted in ways that didn't make sense unless you drove them daily. Still, it kept happening, always after midnight, always slow. Sometimes the lights would pause, idling somewhere I couldn't see, engine low and patient. When they finally moved on, the darkness felt heavier than before. A couple weeks later, new sounds joined the routine. Early mornings, just before the sky started to lighten, faint clicks and soft pressure came from the front door. It wasn't violent or rushed, more like someone checking a locked car in a parking lot. One morning it was the back door, another time a window frame near the laundry room. Whoever it was never stayed long, and nothing was damaged. I walked the house afterward, heart thumping, finding everything exactly as I'd left it. That somehow made it worse. Locks untouched meant the person testing them knew they could wait. The storm arrived without much warning, rolling in heavy and loud, flattening the fields with rain, and bending the trees until they groaned. The power cut out first, then the cell signal dropped to nothing, leaving the house humming with rain and silence. Candles barely pushed back the dark, and the wind kept hitting the walls like it was trying to listen through them. That was when the headlights came back, brighter this time, stopping so close the glow leaked under the curtains. I stood there realizing something with a clarity that made my chest ache. Whoever was outside hadn't been trying to get in before. They'd been learning the house, learning me, and waiting for the moment when no one could hear me call for help. I stayed still, listening, counting the seconds between gusts of wind and the soft idle of an engine somewhere beyond the trees. The rain masked smaller sounds, but not all of them. Gravel shifted, slow footsteps pressing into wet ground, careful enough not to splash. A shadow moved past one of the side windows, tall and narrow, pausing where the glass met the frame. There was no rush in the movement, no panic. It felt practiced, like someone following steps they'd rehearsed in their head many times. I backed away from the window, keeping to the darker part of the room, trying to control my breathing as the house creaked around me. The first real contact came at the back door. Not a knock, not a bang, just the gentle turn of the handle testing the resistance. Metal whispered against metal. It stopped, then tried again, slower, as if whoever was outside wanted to feel exactly how much pressure it took. I moved through the hallway on bare feet, each board threatening to betray me with noise. The flashlight in my hand shook enough that the beam bounced along the walls. When I reached the kitchen, the handle stopped moving, replaced by a long, thoughtful silence. I imagined someone standing there in the rain, hand resting on the door, deciding what came next. Minutes stretched until time lost its shape. The storm howled, thunder rolling so close it rattled the cabinets. Then the testing began again, this time at a window near the living room. Fingers brushed the glass, slow and deliberate, tracing the edge like they were memorizing it. I crouched behind the couch, phone useless in my hand, and realized how completely cut off I was. No lights from neighbors, no passing cars, nothing but fields and dark. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about breaking in fast. It was about waiting me out, seeing how long fear could do the work instead. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The headlights stayed for a while longer, washing the side of the house in white, then finally pulled away. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed what I could carry and left the house unlocked behind me, gravel crunching too loud under my tires as I drove away. Later, a local deputy walked the property and found nothing but deep footprints pressed into the mud near every door and window. No sign of forced entry. I never went back. Whatever patience had been waiting for me out there didn't need another chance. As days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The whole thing, those headlights, the quiet testing, sat with me like a shadow, one I couldn't outrun. It's easy to tell yourself things like, maybe it was just a strange coincidence, or there's a perfectly logical explanation. But deep down, I knew better. I still couldn't explain how someone could have learned that house so thoroughly without ever stepping foot inside, or why they'd only been testing, never forcing. There was no conclusion to the nightmare that made sense. No one came forward. No evidence was found. The sheriff's department gave me the usual keep an eye out talk and moved on. But I couldn't. A few months later, I did some digging trying to find answers, or at least make peace with the strange events. Turns out, a similar pattern had been reported in a nearby town years before. Another woman, renting another old farmhouse, had noticed headlights passing by her home, followed by strange behavior around her doors. She'd left too, but by the time she did, the sheriff had already dropped her case. She was never even given the chance to speak in person, her complaint buried in bureaucracy. Like mine, her story faded into nothingness. I still think about that night. The silence after the headlights disappeared was one of the loudest things I've ever heard. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. I've learned a few things in the time since. How fragile a sense of safety can be. How quickly it can be snatched away. But there's one thing that still haunts me more than anything. Whoever it was wasn't interested in me getting away. They were waiting for the moment when I couldn't leave. And that, more than anything, is what still keeps me up at night. Posting this here feels strange, but the memory still sits heavy with me, and maybe someone out there will recognize pieces of it. At the time, my life was simple and a little worn around the edges, the kind of phase where quiet feels like a solution to everything. I had just bought a neglected rural farm through a county auction, drawn in by the low price and the promise of isolation. The listing described it as vacant for years, a forgotten patch of land with a farmhouse and an old barn leaning into the wind. I imagined slow mornings, manual work, and the kind of silence you can't buy in town. Friends thought it was impulsive, but impulsive felt better than stagnant. The drive out there was long and empty, gravel roads stretching farther than expected. By the time I unlocked the farmhouse door, the sun was already low, turning the fields dull and flat. The first hours were spent opening windows and pushing stale air out of the rooms. Dust coated every surface, but not in the uniform way abandoned places usually collect it. Inside a bedroom closet, shirts still hung on mismatched hangers, sleeves stiff but not decayed. In the kitchen, canned food lined a shelf, labels faded but intact, some arranged with a care that didn't match abandonment. A notebook sat on the table, pages filled with cramped handwriting, dates from only a few months earlier. That detail caught my attention more than anything else, because the auction paperwork claimed no one had lived there in years. I walked room to room, noticing small things that felt paused rather than left behind. A chair angled toward a window, a pair of work boots by the door, a half-used bar of soap. None of it fit the story I had been sold. As evening settled in, the property took on a different tone. Sounds carried farther than expected, each creak of wood snapping sharp in the open air. While unloading tools from my truck, a dull thud echoed from the barn, deep and hollow. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal scramble either. It sounded deliberate, like weight shifting. I stood still, listening, counting my breaths without meaning to. The barn doors were shut, chained the way I'd left them earlier. When I walked closer, the smell of hay and damp earth grew stronger, and the noise stopped completely. That silence felt heavier than the sound had been. Later that night, curiosity won out over caution. With a flashlight in hand, I crossed the yard again, beam cutting through tall grass and catching movement that turned out to be nothing at all. Near the barn, fresh footprints pressed into the dirt, clear and sharp, leading away from the doors toward the farmhouse. They weren't mine, and they weren't old. The prints followed a path I had walked earlier, then veered off, circling back toward the house. Standing there, I felt exposed in a way that's hard to explain, like the land itself was watching. I locked every door when I went back inside, double-checking each one, even though I knew it wouldn't change much. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sense that the house wasn't as empty as it claimed to be. Morning light didn't bring the relief I expected. The house looked ordinary again, almost harmless, but the details from the night before refused to fade. Over coffee made with bottled water, I went through the notebook I'd found, reading the entries slowly. The writing jumped between mundane notes about chores and sharper comments about noises, doors left open, and shadows near the tree line. One page mentioned someone entering the barn repeatedly, always after dark, always leaving no trace by morning. That conflicted with the official records I'd reviewed before buying the place, so I drove into the nearest town to ask questions. The county office was small, quiet, and smelled faintly of old paper. When I mentioned the farm, the clerk paused longer than necessary before answering. According to public records, the previous owners had left abruptly, citing safety concerns that never made it into formal complaints. No police reports, no inspections, no follow-up visits. It was treated like a quiet relocation, the kind rural families make without explanation. An older man waiting behind me leaned in and said he remembered lights moving across that land late at night, long after it was supposed to be empty. He shrugged it off as trespassers or kids looking for trouble, but his voice lacked conviction. Driving back, I noticed tire tracks near the fence line that hadn't been there the day before. They stopped short of the road as if someone preferred not to be seen coming or going. By the time I reached the house, the sense of being observed had returned. That afternoon, I focused on clearing brush around the barn, trying to ground myself in physical work. Inside, the air felt warmer than it should have, carrying a faint smell of sweat and old fabric. In a corner stall, I found a blanket folded neatly, still holding the shape of recent use. There were food wrappers tucked behind a beam, the kind you'd eat in a hurry, trying not to make noise. None of it belonged to me, and none of it looked old enough to match an abandoned property. As the sun dipped again, the same sounds returned, footsteps shifting above the hayloft. I called out, my voice echoing uselessly against wood and metal, and the movement stopped immediately. Night fell faster than I wanted it to. From the farmhouse window, I saw a light flicker in the barn, faint but unmistakable. This time, I didn't approach blindly. I grabbed my truck keys and headlights swept the yard as I drove closer, flooding the space with harsh white beams. The barn stood open, doors wide, chain cut clean through. No one was inside, but the footprints were there again, leading straight back toward the house. I didn't stay to search further. I left the property before midnight, drove until my hands steadied on the wheel, and didn't return until days later with help. The farm was sold again soon after, quietly, and I never learned who had been living there, or why they stopped the moment I showed up. Returning to the property days later felt different, like crossing into a place that no longer wanted me there. I brought a friend with me, someone practical who didn't scare easily, and we walked the land in daylight. The farmhouse looked unchanged, but the barn told another story. Inside, the blanket was gone, the wrappers vanished, and the loft was swept clean as if someone had taken care to erase themselves. Even the footprints had been smoothed out, dirt dragged flat with something heavy. My friend tried to laugh it off, suggested squatters who got nervous once the place sold. The explanation sounded thin even as he said it. Nothing about the cleanup felt rushed or careless. We spent hours checking every structure, every shed, every line of fence. Near the far edge of the property, hidden behind tall weeds, we found a narrow footpath leading into the woods. It wasn't marked on any map, worn down just enough to suggest repeated use. Along the trail were small signs of life: a crushed soda can, a scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, boot marks half filled with dirt. Whoever used it knew how to move without leaving much behind. Standing there, I realized how easy it would be to watch the house from that spot, to wait until lights went out. The isolation I had wanted suddenly felt like exposure instead. That night I stayed in a motel in town instead of the farmhouse. Sleep came easier there, but my thoughts kept circling back to the notebook and those recent dates. The idea that someone had been living alongside the myth of abandonment unsettled me more than any noise. It wasn't a ghost story or some dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that. Someone had been there, close enough to hear footsteps, close enough to know routines, and careful enough to vanish when attention arrived. The county never followed up, and no one seemed interested in reopening the past. Silence, I learned, can be a form of protection in small places. In the end, I made a practical choice. I listed the farm and sold it without ever spending another night there. I never mentioned the belongings or the footprints, just said the land wasn't the right fit. Sometimes I still think about whoever lived in those shadows and why they stopped when I appeared. Maybe they moved on to another forgotten place, or maybe they learned to stay hidden better. I don't know, and that's the part that lingers. The farm taught me that isolation doesn't always mean empty, and that some spaces remember people long after the records forget them. Moving into that house marked the start of a quieter chapter of my life, or at least that's what I believed at the time. I had just inherited a small place tucked far from any city, surrounded by fields that rolled on longer than my patience for traffic ever had. My days back then were simple: remote work in the mornings, unpacking boxes in the afternoons, and long walks at dusk to clear my head. The town itself looked like something preserved on purpose. One main road, a few aging storefronts and houses spaced just far enough apart to feel private. I told people online I was craving isolation, but the truth was I needed distance from everything that had piled up behind me. The house wasn't special: creaky floors, outdated cabinets, a porch that leaned slightly to the left. Still, it felt like a reset button I desperately wanted to press. The locals made a point of introducing themselves within my first few days. Always polite, always brief. Names slipped out of my head quickly, but faces didn't, especially the way some of them lingered longer than necessary when we spoke. Conversations followed the same pattern: questions about how long I planned to stay, whether I worked from home, and what time I usually turned in at night. At first, I chalked it up to small-town curiosity, the kind people warn you about but never really explain. Every wave from across the road felt practiced, synchronized even. One woman, Rachel, who lived 2 houses down, casually mentioned she noticed my porch light stayed on late. She said it with a laugh, but it landed heavier than she probably intended. It didn't take long before people started commenting on my movements before I ever brought them up. Someone at the general store asked if my morning walks helped with sleep, even though I hadn't mentioned them to anyone. Another neighbor suggested I avoid certain back roads once the sun dipped too low, offering no reason beyond a shrug and a vague warning tone. The strangest part wasn't the advice itself, but how consistent it was, as if everyone had rehearsed the same lines. Each evening, I caught glimpses of figures lingering near fences or parked trucks that hadn't been there moments before. Curtains across the street shifted whenever my front door opened. I started varying my routine without telling anyone, just to see if the comments would stop. They didn't. The first real crack in my sense of safety came quietly, almost easy to miss. A kitchen drawer I knew I had closed sat open when I returned from a short drive. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, and the locks were exactly as I'd left them. Over the next few days, it kept happening. Small things out of place, a chair angled differently, a window unlatched but not forced. When I mentioned it at the local station, the officer listened with a thin patience that felt rehearsed. He suggested stress, settling in nerves, and reminded me that people here respected privacy. Walking back home, I noticed the same parked truck at the edge of my driveway that had been there earlier. Engine cold, tires dusty. That was the moment I understood I wasn't just being watched. I was being monitored. Sleep became fragmented after that, not because of noise, but because of the silence pressing in on me. At night, the house made sounds I couldn't quite place, soft shifts that didn't belong to old wood settling. I started leaving objects exactly where I could remember them, down to the angle of a mug handle or the position of a rug corner. More than once, I woke to find those details altered by morning. The air inside the house sometimes carried a faint scent that wasn't mine, like unfamiliar soap or cold fabric pulled from storage. When I asked Rachel if she ever had issues with people wandering onto her property, she paused longer than usual before answering. She told me everyone looks out for each other here, and that I should be grateful for the attention. The sense of being managed rather than protected grew stronger as days passed. People would appear when I returned home, as if alerted the moment my tires hit the gravel. One man I'd never spoken to greeted me by name while leaning against my mailbox, commenting on how late I was compared to usual. I asked how he knew, and he smiled like I'd asked something naive. He said routines matter in places like this, that predictability keeps things peaceful. That word stuck with me, peaceful, because nothing about the way he said it felt calm. It sounded more like a rule than a reassurance. I tried pushing back in small ways, staying out longer, taking different routes, leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using. The reactions came quickly. A note appeared on my porch one evening, written in careful block letters, warning me about roads I didn't need to test. Another time, someone knocked just after dark to tell me my back window had been open earlier, even though I'd been home all day. When I mentioned the notes and visits to the authorities again, the response was polite but firm. They said newcomers often misread community concern, and that stirring things up wouldn't help me settle in. The message was clear without being spoken outright. Isolation crept in next, heavy and deliberate. Phone calls dropped unexpectedly, internet outages became frequent, and my requests for repairs were delayed without explanation. I stopped receiving mail altogether for a stretch, even though I saw the delivery truck pass by. The house felt smaller with each passing night, like the walls were inching closer in agreement with the town. I realized then that leaving wasn't just discouraged, it was expected if I couldn't adapt. Outsiders didn't challenge the rhythm here. They either learned it or disappeared from it, and for the first time since arriving I understood that the house wasn't the thing I'd inherited. It was the test. The turning point came late in the afternoon, when I returned from a supply run and found the front door unlocked. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the handle, replaying every movement of my hands before I'd left. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at first glance, but the house carried that same unfamiliar scent again, stronger this time. On the kitchen table sat a folded piece of paper I knew hadn't been there before. It wasn't threatening, not directly. It simply listed times, my usual departure, my return when lights went out. At the bottom, one sentence was written smaller than the rest, reminding me that life runs smoother when everyone agrees on the order of things. I didn't bother calling the authorities again. Instead, I packed a bag with only what I could carry: clothes, documents, my laptop, and a few personal items that still felt like mine. As dusk settled in, cars passed my house slower than usual, headlights lingering on the windows. Someone knocked once, firm but unhurried, then walked away when I didn't answer. I stayed still on the living room floor, breathing shallow, listening to footsteps circle the house without ever rushing. It wasn't fear that pinned me there. It was clarity. This place wasn't dangerous in the way people expect. It was organized, and I wasn't part of the system. When night fully set in, I slipped out through the back, walking across the fields instead of using the driveway. The land dipped and rose in uneven waves, my shoes soaking through with dew. Behind me, I could hear distant engines starting, doors closing, but no one shouted or chased. They didn't need to. By the time I reached the main road, my legs burned and my phone had no signal, but the silence finally felt empty instead of watched. I flagged down a passing truck hours later and didn't explain much, only that I needed a ride far away. The driver didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. I never went back for the rest of my things. Weeks later, I received a single forwarded envelope at a temporary address, containing the house keys and a short note thanking me for understanding how things work there. No return address, no signature. I sold the property without setting foot on it again, accepted a price far lower than it was worth, and considered it a fair trade. Sometimes I still catch myself tracking routines out of habit, checking windows twice, listening too closely. I don't talk about that town out loud, but I know this much for sure. Some places don't want you harmed, they just want you compliant.